Chapter 2169. It really is you. Looks like you've finally made the decision you weren't willing to make in the past. Luo Fan murmured. His voice directly penetrated the endless space-time and entered the pseudo-heavenly law. He saw traces of the power at the core of the pseudo-heavenly law. As his voice spread, the power trembled slightly. The entire pseudo-heavenly law began to shake violently, as if an even more terrifying power was brewing. However, a trace of Luo Fan's consciousness sensed his fury from it. It was the kind of fury that came from having one's scars reopened. In the face of such a situation and such a change, Luo Fan's expression was indifferent, and an indescribable smile hung faintly on his face. This kind of smile was imprinted into Shu Xi's eyes, and it made her feel much calmer in her heart. Even if the surrounding situation was so bad that the entire world was about to be overturned in the next moment, and all the Guardians were about to be dragged into the quagmire of war, it couldn't affect his sense of security. It was as if with Luo Fan's existence, all problems were no longer problems. All the bad outcomes that could possibly happen would never happen again. This kind of strong confidence was even stronger than Luo Fan's confidence in himself, and it even seemed to be inexplicably blind. As Luo Fan smiled faintly, the avatars lifted their feet and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived above the void. They had crossed countless obstacles and various natural moats that could completely isolate living beings from the pseudo-heavenly way. They had directly arrived before the pseudo-heavenly way. His figure was extremely small. At least, compared to the huge pseudo-heavenly law that almost covered the entire world, he was so small that he could not be distinguished at all. However, such a tiny existence was showing an unimaginable sense of existence at this moment. All living beings who were looking up at the pseudo-heavenly law immediately shifted their attention from the pseudo-heavenly law to Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his hand and patted the pseudo-heavenly law. In an instant, his palm turned illusory and disappeared without a trace, as if it had entered another space-time. Of course, it was obvious that it only looked like it. Among the many living beings who were looking up at the pseudo-heavenly law, there were billions of Guardians. Almost all of them were tribulation-stage powerhouses. Such powerhouses had powerful eyesight and senses that had long reached a height that ordinary cultivators could not imagine. In their eyes, the palm did not enter the unknown trillions of space-time that they could sense. It was as if the palm had completely disappeared. At this moment, the pseudo-heavenly law began to tremble violently. The beams of light that shot down from the pseudo-heavenly Tao and plunged into the endless region below began to distort violently. Soon after, the light pillars began to collapse one after another. In the blink of an eye, the number of light pillars had been reduced by half, and in the blink of an eye, they had completely disappeared. As the pillar of light disappeared, the creatures that had been attracted by the pillar of light and the terrifying pressure that the pillar of light had exerted on the various guarded areas naturally disappeared. The Guardians, who originally wanted to risk their lives and even wanted to perish together with the pillar of light, were all dumbfounded. They suddenly wondered if they were dreaming. Whether it was before or now, that seems to be the Guardian that caused so much chaos back then. What kind of existence is he? How can he so easily resolve the calamity of this world? A Guardian murmured with disbelief in his eyes. His expression was filled with indescribable shock. Is this really the level that a Guardian can reach? Another Guardian murmured at this moment, an indescribable fighting spirit vaguely appearing in his eyes. Apart from these various attitudes, most of the Guardians' minds were already blank. They could not think at all, and no thoughts flashed through their minds. As expected, as long as he makes a move, anything can be resolved. At this moment, Shu Xi had an expression of as expected. Although there was unconcealable shock in her eyes, compared to the other Guardians, she seemed to take it for granted. At this moment, Luo Fan frowned slightly. He retracted his palm and struck out again. The palm disappeared once more. However, compared to before, although the disappearance this time was still the same, it gave off an indescribable feeling. It was as if the two disappearances had entered a completely different place. As his palm struck out, the pseudo-heavenly way began to tremble violently. The blood-red sky began to rapidly fade, and the true sky and the true heavenly way that was originally covered by the blood-red sky began to reveal itself once more. As for the pseudo-heavenly Tao itself, it began to gradually shrink and fuse with the strands of power that Luo Fan was extremely familiar with. The numerous laws, heaven and earth, space, and time all began to rapidly separate from that power and gradually let go of that power. At the same time, it also let go of the suppression on the entire world, letting go of the changes it caused to the entire world. What method did you use? The power began to condense, turning into a tiny long river that emitted such a shocking voice. Not only were the guardians dumbfounded by the changes just now, but even the existence that was directly affected by the power was also dumbfounded. He had no idea what was going on. This method seemed to be even more strange than when his main body encountered Luo Fan. At the very least, his first move vaguely had the same power as before, allowing him to use the results of his research over the past few days to slightly resist it and not be wiped out. However, the second move had nothing to do with the attack from before, and it directly made all the countermeasures that he had thought of over the past few days go up in smoke to this existence. This sort of situation was extremely frightening. It went without saying. "I don't think there's a need to explain it to you," said Luo Fan. As he spoke, he withdrew his palm again. As he withdrew his palm, the wisps of power seemed to have lost their foundation. With a loud bang, they completely collapsed, as if they were condensed from endless power. They naturally scattered into the surrounding void, and were completely devoured by the surrounding world and space-time, disappearing without a trace. The world completely returned to its clear state at this moment. The scene that seemed like the end of the world was like a lifetime ago in the blink of an eye. The guardians were even more dumbfounded, and they did not dare to believe everything that had happened in front of them. It must be known that only a few breaths had passed since Luo Fan appeared until the world returned to its clear state. Before this, they'd even prepared themselves for complete failure, death, and even their mental states would change completely. How could they react to such a drastic change so quickly? It's a pity that I can't reach deep enough and can't directly wipe out his main body. At this moment, Luo Fan looked at the heaven's law that had already returned to its calm state, and a helpless expression appeared on his face as such thoughts flashed through his mind. The attack he used just now seemed strange, and even the guardians and the existence he attacked couldn't understand it. They couldn't imagine what he was capable of. However, it was actually just the wisps of comprehension that he had obtained from communicating with the various levels over the years. In other words, what he attacked just now was indeed used on the existence. Moreover, the attack did not contain too many unimaginable mysteries, and the power was only ordinary. However, the target was not on the real world, but on another level. What he attacked with the first attack was the concept of the existence that belonged to a wisp of power. Although the cultivator that was designated as Luo Fan's opponent by the world, or rather by the fifth tribulation, was powerful and had even fused with the heaven's law to a certain extent and grasped the heaven's law's energy that far surpassed Luo Fan's by who knew how many tens of thousands of times. However, it was limited to the limits of one's understanding, and it did not involve other levels. This was not the limit of the heaven's law. In fact, the heaven's law itself involved many levels, and if the profundities within it were developed, one could even easily step into other levels and control them. Just like what Luo Fan was doing at this moment, the reason why the cultivator could not do this was because he did not have such a concept, and he did not recognize the existence of other levels. In this way, he would naturally be unable to effectively control the heavenly energy that also involved other levels of the heavenly energy. In this way, Even if the heaven's law could protect the various existences that corresponded to him in other levels, such as his own concept of existence, his karma origin, his wisdom origin, his courage origin, and so on, it was only an instinctive protection. Although the protection was flawless, it was not targeted at all. This kind of protection might be enough for ordinary cultivators, but for existences that had reached Luo Fan's level, it was equivalent to directly laying out one's weakness in front of him. He did not even need to use any abilities. He only needed to use the force of his palm to circle and turn, and it would be enough to find the weak point of the protection. He would directly break through the weak point and send the force of his palm into the corresponding existence, directly destroying it. As for why the first move did not work, it was because his first move targeted the opponent's concept of existence, an existence that he had already attacked once before. For existences that had reached a certain level of cultivation, as long as they encountered an attack once, no matter how much they did not understand the principle of the attack, no matter how they could not grasp the point of the attack, they would be able to use all sorts of methods to defend against the attack. Because of this, the first attack that targeted the concept of existence was easily defended against by the existence. As a result, Luo Fan could not directly erase it with his bit of consciousness, and could only destroy the various attacks of the pseudo-heaven's law. As for the second move, he learned from the first move, and directly changed the direction. He set off from the karma level, directly blasting into the karma level, and attacked the opponent's karma origin. Because this kind of attack had never appeared before, the opponent naturally did not carry out any targeted defense against it. In this way, this kind of attack could naturally have an unimaginable effect, easily completely erasing the opponent's bit of power. It could be predicted that if he encountered this existence again, this kind of attack against the karma level would very likely be as ineffective as the previous attack against the concept level. But to Luo Fan, this was not a problem at all. Unless the opponent could completely grasp all levels like him, he only needed to attack from a different level, and he would naturally be able to get rid of the opponent. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that Luo Fan's entire body was within the heavenly Tao and was completely protected by the heavenly Tao, Luo Fan's consciousness alone would have been enough to completely erase him. As many thoughts flashed through his mind, Luo Fan shook his head, and the sliver of consciousness descended once more. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived on the platform where his main body was. "Just who is it?" Shu Si asked when she saw Luo Fan's consciousness. Naturally, what she was asking was who the pseudo-heaven's law was. Why did it have such a powerful method that could so easily get rid of all the resistance in this world, and even almost completely overturn this world? When Luo Fan heard this, he only smiled and said, "That should be the spokesperson of the heaven's law." As he spoke, he thought of a certain existence in the legends, Hongjun. The main body that the long river represented was clearly an existence similar to the legendary Hongjun. It was a cultivator who had a deep connection with the heaven's law, and should have been the spokesperson of the heaven's law in this world. If the heaven's law did not appear normally, he could be said to be the heaven's law. The spokesperson of the heaven's law. Shu Si was shocked when she heard this. Although she had never heard of the concept of a spokesperson of the heaven's law, and she did not know that such an existence existed in this world, she already knew what the spokesperson of the heaven's law represented just from the name alone. She also understood how unbelievable the strength of the spokesperson of the heaven's law was. After understanding this, she could not help but feel proud of herself for being able to last so long against him. Although she quickly suppressed this emotion, it had still left a mark in her heart. After that feeling of pride, she was filled with endless doubts. The spokesperson of the heaven's law was supposed to be the existence that had the most harmony with the heaven's law. Its mission should have been one step further than the protectors, and it should have been an existence that protected the entire world. Why did it seem like that existence was going to overturn this world, and even resist the heaven's law? Then why? Shu Si was about to ask. However, Luo Fan already smiled and said, "You shouldn't know about these things. If you know too much, it will instead cause unnecessary trouble." As he spoke, with a thought, he directly manipulated the boundless mysterious power in the protective platform beneath his feet, allowing the mysterious power to spread out in all directions. In the blink of an eye, it had already completely enveloped the tens of millions of regions that were protected by the protective platform, completely cutting off all connections between these regions and the outside world. These tens of millions of areas were originally connected to the 1 billion protectors, forming a whole. Now that they were suddenly cut off, the whole instantly lost a large piece, and an inexplicable chaos instantly appeared in this whole. Endless mysterious power surged in all directions, instantly stirring up the 1 billion areas, causing the space-time, the world, the laws, the civilizations, and the living beings to all become chaotic. After a while, under the suppression of the many bewildered protectors, it once again calmed down. After that, with a single thought from Luo Fan, the tens of millions of regions produced an indescribable attractive and decomposing force. It directly devoured and decomposed the countless life forms and mysterious forces that had stepped into the tens of millions of regions through the pillars of light, directly turning them into the potential of the tens of millions of regions. They became resources for the growth of these regions, causing the skies of these regions to become higher and the ground to become thicker and thicker. The vitality that filled these regions became denser and denser. This situation was naturally a great thing for these regions. It would allow these regions to grow even faster in the future. However, for the living beings that were sent into these areas, and for the guardian platforms that were sent into these areas by the mysterious power, this was a great misfortune. For a time, all sorts of mournful cries, wails, and curses continuously rang out from all over this area, and even from the guardian platforms that were located all over this region. After losing the influence of the pseudo-heavenly Tao, although the protectors were still affected by the baleful aura, resentment, and other negative auras, they eventually regained their rationality, and their ability to think had completely recovered. Under such circumstances, they naturally knew how to weigh the pros and cons, and knew how to weigh the benefit. They had even made the decision to withdraw their power and return to the living beings in other regions. Now that the sudden pain had drowned them, it had almost blinded their rationality. Chapter 2170. Does he want to cause another tribulation? Some protectors were secretly terrified, and they naturally showed strong distrust on their faces. At that moment, each of the guardians tried their best to restrain their own strength. A sense of vigilance was revealed, and they viewed the other guardians as potential enemies, potential opponents. For a time, the entire heavens and the earth seemed to have returned to the dangerous state before the tribulation. It seemed as if a single spark would cause a world-shaking explosion, and it would cause the entire world to return to the state of impending tribulation overnight. As they did their best to withdraw their power and the living beings under their control, the entire world became extremely tense, as if a great disaster was about to befall them. However, peace was restored at a speed that was thousands of times faster than before. In just a few days, the balance that would have taken decades or even centuries to achieve had been re-established. This situation was like the calm before the storm, and it was especially depressing while almost all the protectors were secretly vigilant, preparing to welcome another earth-shattering tribulation. Luo Fan did not do anything else. Instead, he used the fastest speed to completely digest the mysterious power that had invaded the 10 million regions, as well as all the other foreign matter, living beings, and cultivators. Once everything was digested, the strands of his mind that he had split off trembled slightly, and he returned to the mysterious amber, returning to his body. Only you would dare to use this method. At this moment, Shu Si could not help but sigh. She looked at Luo Fan with admiration and speechlessness. After all, she had a better understanding of Luo Fan than the other protectors. At this time, when he thought about it, He already understood why Luo Fan had used all kinds of means just now. What Luo Fan did before was fundamentally to use a strong sense of crisis to oppress the protectors in this world, so that they would do their best to restore peace to the world. This was so that the world would not be in a state of chaos, giving the pseudo-heavenly way an opportunity to take advantage of. Of course, the matter of strengthening the area guarded by these tens of millions of people was just something that he did out of convenience. However, it was obvious that only Luo Fan, who far surpassed the other guardians, could use such a method. It even made the other guardians feel that they could not defeat him even if they joined forces with everyone else. If other guardians were to use this method, even Shu Si, who had already shown her absolute strength in the previous calamity, would definitely not be able to withstand it. She would definitely be attacked by the guardians after they reacted, and she might even die miserably in the end. Only Luo Fan, as long as the other guardians were rational, they would know how great the gap between them was. Thus, it was impossible for them to take the initiative to seek death. Only then would they be able to avoid future troubles. At this moment, the numerous protectors reacted one after another, and their faces revealed an indescribable resentment and displeasure. However, he could only show off a little. He didn't even dare to question Luo Fan. Everything was just as Shu Si had predicted. At this moment, the heavenly Tao in the sky began to gradually disappear. However, compared to before, the heavenly Tao seemed to be vaguely different. It seemed to have gained something, but also seemed to have lost something. Moreover, the connection between the heavenly Tao and Shu Si that could not be severed had almost disappeared. The fact that Shu Si could raise her head and see the heavenly Tao was due to the inertia she had left behind. At this moment, the heavenly Tao became more and more unfamiliar. In the end, when the heavenly Tao completely disappeared, she felt that she was almost completely unfamiliar with the heavenly Tao. Looks like this is really the calm before the storm. Such a thought flashed through Shu Si's mind. The various methods of the pseudo-heaven's way had already been easily broken by Luo Fan, but it was clear that the battle between him and the true heaven's way had already come to an end. It was unknown whether he had completely achieved his goal, or only partially achieved his goal, or whether he had directly paid an unimaginable sacrifice. However, no matter what the situation was, it meant that when he truly recovered, it would definitely be time for him to deal with a certain person, and that certain person was very likely to be Luo Fan, who was in the mysterious amber of power by his side. As all sorts of complicated thoughts flowed through her mind, Shu Si let out a long sigh. Am I worrying unnecessarily now? What does this have to do with me? Moreover, even if it does, what can I do? As she sighed, she sat down cross-legged and closed her eyes. Her mind started to fuse with the mysterious power, and she used it to comprehend the other tens of millions of regions. She carefully sensed the various profound principles and profundities contained in those vast regions, and she worked hard to raise her own understanding of the heavenly Tao in herself in order to raise her own cultivation realm. As for the subsequent evolution of these tens of millions of regions, there was no longer a need for her to interfere. Although these regions had been severely damaged in the previous calamity, everything was back on track after Luo Fan's adjustments and changes. Next, as long as they waited for time to pass, these regions would naturally develop to a more prosperous and mysterious state than before the calamity. As Luo Fan's pressure disappeared, the ominous aura and resentment that had gradually spread in this region were gradually digested by the world, and they gradually disappeared without a trace. The entire region began to gradually return to its original perfect and ordinary state. In the areas guarded by the various guardians, a scene of vitality gradually appeared. At this moment, many protectors poured their power into the construction of these regions without holding back, and they worked hard to eliminate the damage that these regions had suffered in the previous calamity. For the protectors who had formed a protective body with Shu Si, this process was considered simple. After all, although they had withstood the full attack of the pseudo-heavenly Tao, their wills and mentality were still in a normal state. During the attack, they had consciously protected the core of these regions, and they protected the structure of these regions so that they would not completely collapse. In such a situation, they might appear to have suffered serious damage, but as long as the pressure disappeared, they could easily rely on the endless mysterious energy that came from the complete characteristics of that region to easily eliminate the various damaged areas. They could even adjust the structure of these regions and strengthen the vitality of these regions, causing these regions to become even more mysterious and profound. However, compared to them, the regions that had been completely plunged into the quagmire of war were completely different. Perhaps some of these regions had obtained the upper hand in the war, and some had even won. It seemed like the damage in those regions was far less severe than the other regions. However, even the area that suffered the least damage would be thousands of times more difficult to recover than any part of the entire Guardian formation, or even the most severely damaged area. There was no other reason. Even though the regions weren't severely damaged, the mentalities of the Guardians had changed and the platforms themselves were affected by the quagmire of war. As a result, the Guardians couldn't directly use the mysterious power that they used to be able to wield as easily as their own limbs after they recovered. The first thing they had to do was to restore the characteristics of the mysterious power and restore the mysteries contained in the mysterious power. Only by completing this step could they proceed to the next step, which was to restore the various damages in this entire region. Obviously, when it involved mysterious power, even the smallest damage was countless times more difficult than the process of completely shattering and rebuilding a region. It was precisely because of this that they needed to spend more time and energy than any living being in the protective body. They needed to pay a greater price to be able to restore the regions they guarded. During this process, the entire world was vaguely enveloped by an indescribable aura. This aura was a kind of pain, a kind of growth, and a kind of sublimation. Under the envelopment of this aura, the entire world faintly showed a deeper level of vitality. In a trance, it was as if the calamity had left this world forever in the quagmire of war. The protectors were just ants. Although it hadn't been a long time, the number of Guardians that had died had already reached billions. In other words, even if the entire world was in a state of growth and sublimation, there were still billions of regions that were in an extremely awkward situation. Without protectors in these regions, they could only rely on the platforms to instinctively restore these regions. However, the speed at which these regions recovered was clearly many times slower than the regions with protectors. Apart from that, the protector platforms had an even more important task. That was to find new cultivators to be the rulers of the protector platforms. In other words, they were the new protectors. This was clearly not a simple process. This could be seen from the complicated process of selecting protectors for the protector platforms that Luo Fan participated in. This was also a type of chaos that would inevitably appear in this world for a long time to come. Time slowly passed, and 1,000,000 years had passed unknowingly. During these 1,000,000 years, the world had developed in an orderly manner. Now, most regions had returned to peace, and it seemed like they had returned to the various states before the calamity. However, there were also billions of regions that were in an indescribable state of chaos. Those regions were the regions where the protectors were killed during the calamity. At this moment, there were still endless and tragic battles going on around the protector platforms in those regions. The slaughter had taken place among many powerful cultivators. The scene was so tragic that it could be called a world-ending calamity in any world. But in this world, it was just a very ordinary protector selection ceremony. Compared to the calamity that covered the entire world back then, it was so insignificant that it was insignificant. If it was in the past, such chaos would definitely tempt the other protectors around them. They would want to intervene in these regions, directly try to become the protector of these regions, or directly send people to compete for the status of the protector of those regions. In this way, the new protector would naturally have a close relationship with them, and they would naturally be his allies. If there were any problems again, they would be a great help. But that was only in the past. At this time, when the quagmire of war that almost engulfed the entire world had just passed for less than 1,000,000 years, none of the protectors dared to start a war again. It was rare for the protectors of these regions to show rare fairness in the competition, and they were almost completely following the rules of the protector platforms. Under such circumstances, although the interior of those regions seemed to be in chaos, there was an unprecedented order deep down. It was even far greater than the order in other regions guarded by protectors. After all, although the control of the mysterious power in the regions guarded by protectors would be more exquisite and mysterious, and the effects would be more incredible. But as long as it was a living being, there would be selfishness. Even the protectors were no exception. Although these protectors could manipulate the mysterious power of the protector platforms to do countless things that the protector platforms couldn't do, they would also manipulate the mysterious power to do some things that didn't conform to the rules of the protector platforms. For example, they would seek benefits that they shouldn't have for their relatives and friends. There were simply too many things. On the surface, this might not have much impact on the protected regions, and it wasn't enough to affect the order of the protected regions. But on a deeper level, from a more precise point of view, this was indeed a destruction of the order. Even if this kind of destruction wouldn't actually have much impact, destruction was destruction, and it wouldn't stop just because of this. In contrast, these areas without protectors operated completely according to the rules of the protector platforms themselves, relying on these rules to decide and affect everything in them. Although the power of the mysterious power couldn't be perfectly exerted because there were no protectors, causing many factors to take a detour and not be able to use the most direct method to complete it, making the efficiency not high. However, it was precisely because there were no protectors involved that everything could not violate the rules of the protector platforms. The order naturally seemed to be almost absolutely perfect. This situation naturally had a different feeling for the protectors. Since ancient times, since the beginning of the replacement of protectors, the process of selecting protectors for any protector platform could actually not be independent. There would definitely be other protectors involved, and this also resulted in the replacement of protectors from ancient times to the present. Almost none of the replacement of protectors was completely fair and orderly. Almost every replacement of protectors must have some means to break the rules involved, causing the birth of the protectors to be in a relatively fair state. In other words, this absolutely fair process of the birth of protectors was simple for almost all protectors for the first time. The first time for anything could give people an extraordinary feeling. The first change of fairness in front of them also gave the many protectors who were observing an unimaginable feeling. For a moment, the protectors who noticed the existence of this fairness seemed to have understood something in their hearts. They seemed to have vaguely comprehended something that they had neglected before, but it had a great impact on their control of the protector platforms and the mysterious power within them. It even made them feel that if they grasped it, they could greatly improve their attainments in all of this. Fairness. Such a thought flashed through the protectors' minds at this moment. Fairness represented a kind of order. In fact, it could even be said that fairness was a deeper level of order. The fairer it was, the stronger the order. If this kind of order could bring power, it also meant that the power was stronger. However, since ancient times, as long as there were intelligent creatures that could have a certain amount of authority, no matter how much it would inevitably destroy fairness. This made it impossible to find a truly perfect existence of fairness from ancient times to the present, even in the endless world and the endless heavens and earth. Even the process of selecting protectors for the billions of protector platforms seemed to be fair on a certain level. But if one went deeper and looked at each individual, the degree of fairness was also very questionable. Each and every one of the guardians was a peerless genius. Even compared to Luo Fan and Shu Si, there was still a huge gap. However, as geniuses, the essence of their nature was definitely not discounted. Under such geniuses, this unprecedented power of fairness that appeared for the first time gave them an indescribable feeling. It was unknown how many protectors finally recognized its power for the first time, and finally reflected on whether their past actions were appropriate for the first time. This process continued with the selection of the guardian. Unknowingly, another few hundred years had passed. Finally, after such a long period of time, a new guardian was born in a certain area due to a certain coincidence. Chapter 2171. So fairness has this kind of power. If we could have understood this earlier, the previous catastrophe definitely wouldn't have happened. A certain guardian lamented at a certain moment. His lamentation was instantly acknowledged by many guardians who were paying attention to the changes in these regions. It must be noted that these regions were currently giving birth to guardians. Although it was chaotic and cruel, there was a deeper order hidden in the depths of this chaos and cruelty. An order that could support these regions so that they wouldn't fall into complete chaos and collapse. It was precisely the existence of this order that even if the chaos in these regions was thousands or tens of thousands of times stronger, even if there were trillions of civilizations and trillions of cultivators in the entire region, it would only cause a certain stage of chaos in the region. It wouldn't cause the entire region to collapse, nor would it affect the nature of the guardian platforms in these regions. This situation was clearly enough to make them think of the catastrophe that was triggered by the imbalance in the hearts of many cultivators. They thought of the quagmire of war that almost devoured all guardians and existences in this entire region. If this order had been supporting them back then, how could the catastrophe have taken shape? How could the quagmire of war have developed to this point? And how could the pseudo-heavenly Tao have almost completely overturned this region? At this moment, the guardians suddenly had an incomparable desire to establish order in this entire region. Although they didn't really see the relationship between the pseudo-heavenly Tao and the heavenly Tao, through their guesses and deductions, they could clearly understand. The pseudo-heavenly Tao hadn't completely failed and disappeared. In other words, the current peace and stability was only temporary. Who knew when the pseudo-heavenly Tao would make a comeback? If that happened, without enough support, their luck wouldn't be as good as this time. With such worries, one could imagine how much they yearned for the deep order that this fairness represented. As guardians, they naturally weren't ordinary mortals. Since they had already realized the existence of the problem, they naturally couldn't turn a blind eye to it. They naturally began to rack their brains to think of ways to solve this problem. These guardians were all powerful cultivators. Their thoughts were meticulous and cautious, and their thoughts had naturally reached an unimaginable level. As they began to think, they quickly established a general concept. This kind of deep order was born because of this kind of fairness. Therefore, if he wanted to establish such a deep level of order in this world, he obviously had to establish this kind of fairness at the level of this world. In other words, there needed to be some sort of rule, similar to how the Guardian platform chose the Guardian, to be implemented in every region of this world, between every Guardian platform. The fairer, more complete, and more powerful the rules were, the more stable the order would be. Naturally, the resistance to the backlash from the pseudo-heavenly Tao would also be stronger. We need an absolutely fair tribunal to arbitrate everything, one of the guardians said at a certain moment. His words instantly opened up the thoughts that had been brewing in the hearts of the guardians but had yet to break through the fog. The eyes of the guardians lit up as they thought of the benefits of this method. Countless ways to make the arbitration court fairer instantly popped up in their minds. That's right, we need an arbitration court. If there was such an arbitration court in the past, the previous calamity definitely wouldn't have happened. Another guardian chimed in. How should we build this arbitration court? If we want this arbitration court to be absolutely fair, It's impossible for the will of living beings to participate in it. It's even more impossible for it to be controlled by some guardians. In this case, perhaps we can only rely on. A guardian murmured and put forward a specific idea. He did not finish speaking, but almost all the guardians already understood that the only thing they could rely on was the guardian platforms under their feet. From the fact that the pseudo-heavenly Tao needed him to trigger the calamity to change the nature of these guardian platforms, it could be seen that the relationship between these guardian platforms and the pseudo-heavenly Tao was actually not a subordinate relationship. At least, it was not a direct subordinate relationship. Under such circumstances, these guardian platforms clearly had a stronger resistance to the mutation of the heavenly Tao. In other words, as long as the arbitration court could be connected to the nature of those platforms, it would naturally allow the order established by the arbitration court to have a stronger resistance to the mutation of the heavenly Tao. In the end, it would be enough to prevent this world from completely falling into that calamity before the heavenly Tao was completely subverted, so that even in the midst of chaos, there would be fundamental order to support everything and protect the integrity of this world. As expected, only by making the guardian platforms the foundation of this arbitration court can we establish this fairness. A guardian exhaled deeply, his expression full of excitement. Chaos was abhorrent to all existences in the upper echelons of order. These guardians had obviously reached the peak of the perfect order in front of them. It could be said that they were the greatest beneficiaries. Under such circumstances, it was imaginable how much they hated the chaos that broke this order. At this time, after someone suggested a way to prepare, their efficiency was unimaginably high. The guardian platform phantoms flew up from the guardian platforms one after another, and with the help of this mysterious power, they quickly rushed towards a certain place in the void. These guardian platform phantoms were none other than a bit of the aura of these guardian platforms, or rather, a bit of the origin. This bit of origin contained the essence of the guardian platform. It contained the absolute fairness within the guardian platform. The number of guardian platforms in this entire world was in the trillions. Now, it was unknown how many of these guardian platforms' origins were transmitted from all directions and directly gathered in the center of this entire world. At the very least, it was at the center that the guardians recognized. This place was originally just a calm sea, and it didn't seem to be much different from the seawater in any other area. However, at this moment, after the origin of the guardian platforms were cast over, this area began to gradually change. The space-time that originally existed here, the world that existed here, and even all other powers and laws began to undergo some extremely subtle changes during this process. A scene that seemed illusory yet real appeared in the void above this sea. Platforms gathered in this void, and each platform emitted an aura that was indescribable to any living being. Any living being that saw these platforms would be shocked in an instant, and they would feel as if their souls were undergoing some kind of indescribable baptism. The surroundings of the light and shadow where these platforms were located was a vast expanse of whiteness. It seemed as if there was nothing, but it also seemed as if there was everything. As more and more platforms joined in, the void became more and more real and complete. The special characteristic of having everything and existing in the surrounding whiteness became more and more obvious and intense. Moreover, in the center of the interweaving auras of the many platforms, a type of aura that was valued by the many guardians began to grow stronger. It was a type of aura called fairness. In this light and shadow, this aura seemed like the supreme ruler, as well as the most crucial core of this area. It naturally gave off a feeling of suppressing and controlling everything. Amidst the changes, the surrounding laws began to intervene in this spacetime bit by bit, gradually fusing into the vast expanse of white light around the spacetime. It looked like it was gradually breaking the barrier between the spacetime and the outside world, gradually turning this spacetime into a part of the world. The arbitration court. At this moment, Shu Si, who was cultivating, suddenly woke up from her cultivation. With a slight thought, she already knew what had happened in this world while she was cultivating in seclusion. For a moment, she was very interested in the arbitration court. It must be said that compared to the other guardians, Shu Si had a much stronger sense of responsibility towards this world. Compared to the other guardians, she was clearly more willing to see peace in this world, and more willing to see the orderly development of this world. As such, she was naturally looking forward to the role that the arbitration court could play. Then let me join in as well. At this moment, Shu Si gritted her teeth and thought to herself. With that thought, she turned to look at the mysterious power, or rather, the power of the Heaven Tao, which was Luo Fan's power in the amber. She was not the true owner of this platform that was formed from the fusion of tens of millions of guardian platforms. The reason why she could manipulate the endless mysterious power contained in it like the other guardians was only because Luo Fan gave her the authority to control it. Under such circumstances, it was naturally not a problem for her to use the mysterious power in this platform to transform the tens of millions of regions to resist foreign enemies and help this world cope with the tribulations. Even if Luo Fan knew, he would not stop her. However, if she mobilized this power to carry out some kind of crucial or even fatal action such as handing over the authority before Luo Fan's consent, it would obviously offend Luo Fan and even provoke Luo Fan. Perhaps as soon as she wanted to take action, Luo Fan might directly give her a fatal punishment. Naturally, Shu Si was very clear about this. But even if that was the case, even if Luo Fan might deprive her of the authority of this guardian platform and her life before she succeeded in establishing the arbitration court, she did not intend to turn a blind eye at all. Instead, she decided to give it her all and participate in it. This was obviously the result of the unimaginable sense of responsibility that she possessed. At this moment, she no longer hesitated. With a thought, a phantom of a guardian platform formed from millions of overlapping phantoms floated up from the platform beneath her feet. It shot towards the center of the world, or rather, the center that was within the range of the many guardians' knowledge. Because it was formed from tens of millions of guardian platform phantoms, this phantom showed unimaginable substance. This substance was like a real guardian platform streaking across the void and rushing straight toward the void in the center of this world. This sort of change caused the many protectors to be astonished, and they were all indescribably shocked. It should be noted that the bit of origin that they could trigger was only an insignificant bit of the guardian platform's origin. In fact, the phantom was in a state where it could collapse at any time and could even be ignored if they were not careful. Yet, Shu Si was able to draw out so much of the origin energy from the guardian platform, to the extent that the origin energy seemed to have materialized into a real guardian platform. Wasn't this several million times more powerful than the guardian platform's origin energy that they could draw out? Thinking of this, many guardians became inexplicably vigilant. Although this arbitration court is not a plaything under our control, and we won't gain more authority and benefit from the arbitration just because we put in more origin. But in the end, more origin is put in, and the impact is inevitable. I don't know if the fairness will be destroyed. This was the worry in the hearts of many guardians. However, they obviously had no way to stop Shu Si at this time. It was not only because Shu Si's behavior was completely reasonable and there was nothing they could criticize. In fact, those who recognized Shu Si already had a considerable understanding of her, and they knew how much danger she was taking by doing this. All they could feel was admiration for her. More importantly, Shu Si's current strength was almost stronger than any guardian. Among those guardians, only if hundreds of thousands or even millions of them gathered together could they effectively stop her. And obviously, even if they could find millions of guardians to work together to stop Shu Si, it would probably take a lot of time to integrate the power of those guardians. And during this period of time, Shu Si had already sent the origin into the embryonic form of the arbitration court. Crack! An earth-shattering roar sounded from the void in an instant. The moment the seemingly substantial Guardian platform crashed into the spacetime, it triggered the violent reaction of all the phantoms and forces in the spacetime, like a drop of water falling into boiling oil. At this moment, the many platform phantoms in the spacetime that had gradually formed a state of order began to become chaotic. Countless phantoms began to push each other as if they wanted to empty a large enough area in the center to accommodate some behemoth. After the seemingly substantial Guardian platform entered the spacetime, it began to expand frantically. Waves of incomparably terrifying expanding force continuously impacted the surrounding spacetime, the surrounding platform phantoms that were approaching, the surrounding laws that were constantly spreading into the spacetime, and the white light and shadows around the phantoms. All of this felt as if a behemoth had been forcefully stuffed into a container that wasn't big enough. This change made the many Guardians' expressions turn solemn. They already knew that Shu Xi's means were brilliant, but they still felt inexplicably shocked when they saw with their own eyes that just a bit of origin was enough to cause such a shocking change. For a time, it was unknown how many Guardians who had been in the quagmire of war and had their minds blinded and their mentalities distorted truly confirmed the truth of the legend. Shu Xi had indeed far surpassed all of them. She had even reached a height that they could not imagine. Guardians can actually reach this level. Some Guardians murmured, and there was even a look of longing in their eyes. After all, the Guardian platform was only condensed by Shu Xi according to the normal method. It was just the origin that belonged to the Guardian platforms beneath her feet. She did not add anything else into it as the other Guardians had thought. Therefore, although the movement caused was so huge, the platforms still gradually tended to stabilize in the end. They gradually established a new balance with the other Guardian platform phantoms that originally existed in this spacetime, gradually making that spacetime more stable and stronger than before. As this change was completed, Shu Xi vaguely felt that the tens of millions of Guardian platforms under her feet seemed to have an additional inexplicable aura, as if they had been added to an unimaginable system and received some kind of supreme blessing and indescribable support. It really works. Sensing this change, Shu Xi was secretly delighted. Chapter 2172. The arbitration court continued to pull the surrounding laws into it. Although the area where the platform phantoms were didn't change, it didn't grow at all. But the vast expanse of whiteness around it was constantly expanding, as if it was constantly being replenished in the process, and in the end it continued to expand. However, compared to the platforms that became more and more real and substantial as more and more platforms joined, the surrounding whiteness became more and more illusory as it expanded. It was as if it was constantly spreading itself and exchanging its density for breadth. Originally, this core was in a very ordinary sea, but as time passed, as the space-time changed, it gradually showed the true characteristics that a core should have. Vaguely, it seemed to have become the core of this entire world. It seemed that all the regions, all the living beings, all the laws, and even the deeper layers had begun to revolve around this space-time. The vast expanse of whiteness around this space-time seemed incomparably solid when they approached the interior of that space-time. It even felt more solid than everything in reality. Such an existence gradually became illusory, and when it turned into a state that couldn't be observed by the naked eye, the area it occupied had reached a vast area that was almost the size of a world. But at this stage, it could still be sensed by cultivators and guardians with the help of mysterious powers. If there was a cultivator or a guardian who used their perception to sense this area, they would definitely be able to see the vast expanse of white filling the void. However, this was clearly not the end. Next, the area continued to attract more and more laws into it, and it continued to expand outward. While the area continued to grow, it also became more and more illusory. In the end, when even ordinary guardians couldn't see the vast expanse of whiteness even with their mysterious power, the area had grown to the size of an area guarded by a guardian. At this moment, in the interior of the spacetime, where there were many Guardian platform origins, there were hundreds of millions of platform origins here. Making a rough calculation, apart from the regions that hadn't chosen a guardian yet, almost all the guardians had sent a bit of their platform origin into this spacetime. In other words, at this point, it could be said that the process that the guardians could work hard for had come to an end. Whether the arbitration court could take shape, how strong the arbitration effect would be for them, how insistent it would be for fairness, and how stable it would be for order, all of this depended on the development and evolution of everything. Although the guardians couldn't sense the evolution of the whiteness, they knew that it would continue to expand. As long as there were still areas that weren't under its control, it wouldn't stop. In other words, perhaps it would only stop after this vast expanse of whiteness had completely enveloped all the spacetime, all the regions, and all the heavens and earth. Even the regions that hadn't chosen a guardian would involuntarily enter the arbitration court and be controlled by it. After all, at this point, the general trend had already been formed. Unless one used unimaginable power to resist, no matter what existence it was, it would be devoured by the general trend and dragged into the arbitration court. At this moment, all the guardians felt an inexplicable transformation being born in this world. The transformation was extremely crucial to this world, and it even involved the essence of this world. It could vaguely change everything that appeared in this world. All the guardians were filled with anticipation, joy, and even excitement when they sensed the imminent transformation. That was because this transformation wasn't a natural change to the world. Instead, it was a change that occurred under their influence. It could be said that it was a trace that they left in this world. It could even be said that this represented the highest achievement of their subjective initiative. Under such circumstances, how could they not look forward to it? How could they not be happy? How could they not be excited? This world was simply too vast. In terms of area alone, it had even exceeded the limit that could be described with numbers. Under such circumstances, it would take an incomparably long period of time for the vast expanse of whiteness to cover the entire world. In other words, this transformation that seemed to be brewing would obviously take a long time before it could truly be completed. Every single one of the guardians was extremely clear about this. However, to the guardians, every single one of them had lived for billions of trillions of years. Compared to such a period of time, even if the brewing process took billions of years, it was nothing to them. Therefore, even though they knew how long this transformation process would take, none of them showed any anxiety because of it. Instead, their anticipation, joy, and excitement continued to settle, becoming more and more mellow. Just like this, time passed slowly, and in the blink of an eye, 30 million years had passed. Over the past 30 million years, the numerous regions that did not have any guardians in the past had also successively given birth to guardians. Now, all the guardians had been filled, and there was no longer a single guardian platform in the entire world that could not find a guardian ruler. These newly born guardians naturally sensed that some kind of general trend was advancing in this world. After communicating with the other guardians, they understood the existence of the arbitration court. At that moment, their admiration for the senior guardians reached an indescribable level, and they vaguely felt an inexplicable reverence. It must be known that this was a method to transform the entire world and even reverse the development process of the entire world. To be able to gather and perform such a method, these guardians were powerful, open-minded, and high realm. Just thinking about it made them feel awe. In this way, their choice was very obvious. Not a single guardian who became a guardian later refused to join the arbitration court. Instead, after knowing that they could join, they wished that they could reverse the time of this world and return to the time before the arbitration court was built to join it. In this way, after 30 million years of development, the arbitration court finally made up for the last imperfection, allowing the entire arbitration court to expand more than 100 times faster than before. As more and more areas were covered by the arbitration court, the guardians began to feel the benefits brought by the arbitration court. They felt the unprecedented sense of fairness and order emanating from the depths of the world. This new feeling made the Guardians extremely excited for their original decision, and their actions gradually returned to the way they were before the calamity, allowing the world to regain its original vitality. The depression and vigilance after the calamity had unknowingly disappeared. This process lasted for 300 million years. On a certain day after 300 million years, hundreds of millions of Guardians in this world simultaneously sensed that a major change was about to occur. They stopped what they were doing and involuntarily turned their gazes to the arbitration court at the center of the world. Now, compared to 300 million years ago, the arbitration court was countless times stronger and more perfect than before. If the court of arbitration spacetime was said to be an artificial spacetime built by the power of many Guardians, then after 300 million years of continuous development and perfection, the court of arbitration spacetime had long been integrated with this world. It was so perfect that it didn't seem to have anything to do with an artificial spacetime. The scene that was originally formed by the countless Guardian platform phantoms had turned into a blur, as if it had become an extremely mysterious and bizarre state where endless spacetime had been compressed and piled together. And in this endless haze, there was an incomparably fair and orderly figure floating in the middle of the haze. This figure was incomparably huge. In terms of size, even thousands of worlds couldn't accommodate its existence. If this figure was combined with the other figures, the spacetime seemed to be able to fuse with this figure. It was hazy, as if endless heaven and earth had shrunk and piled up in one place, like the boundless clouds and mist surrounding this figure, arbitration judge. This was the information that emerged in the hearts of all the Guardians the moment they saw this figure. At the same time, they instantly understood what kind of characteristics this figure contained and what kind of incredible power it possessed. This figure was, in fact, a manifestation of a fundamental law that was condensed from the fairness and order contained in all the Guardian platforms in this world. It was somewhat similar to the will of heaven and earth, but it was fundamentally different from the will of heaven and earth. Because it was nothing more than a manifestation of the fundamental law, it had no selfishness or even a sense of self. Even if it had wisdom, such an existence, since its birth, would naturally implement all the settings that constituted it. It would naturally adhere to fairness and order. No matter who it was, there was no possibility of favoritism or concealment in front of it. In fact, although the arbitration court was only gradually taking shape over the past 300 million years, it had already accepted most of the disputes in this world. Although it wasn't completely based on the situation of both parties, the arbitration court didn't resolve the disputes directly. But in every dispute, every battle, and every time a war broke out, he set the final bottom line for them. It set the final order for them. This kind of bottom line, this kind of order, did not dictate which side could obtain victory. Instead, it would limit the strength of both sides based on the more complicated comparison between the two sides, and limit the corresponding degree of damage that both sides could cause to the world in the process. Any power that exceeded this bottom line would naturally be eliminated. Throughout the entire process, even the parties fighting didn't know that the arbitration court had participated in it. To them, they only knew that no matter how they attacked, no matter how terrifying the destructive power they gathered, they could no longer destroy the area they were in and cause irreparable chaos. This situation was obviously what the Guardians were looking forward to. Now that this had happened, it meant that the Guardians' plan had succeeded. After all, although the Guardians wanted to protect this world and prevent it from falling into the same calamity as before, it didn't mean that they were willing to have a more powerful existence appear above their heads to restrain them. The way the arbitration court existed was obviously what they wanted to see. And at this moment, while the Guardians looked at the arbitration judge suddenly made a move that had never been seen before. He pointed to the sky with one hand and pointed to the ground with the other. He didn't speak, but all the creatures in the endless spacetime seemed to be swept by his gaze and seemed to hear the endless complicated thoughts in his heart. In a trance, countless guardians understood that this was the last time they would see the arbitration judge. It was also the last time they would see the arbitration court. So that's how it is. Sure enough, this is reasonable. Shu Si also looked at the arbitration judge and the arbitration court. At this moment, she couldn't help but sigh with emotion. After being perfected for more than 300 million years, the arbitration court had now reached the final juncture and could truly reach a perfect state at any time. In other words, it could truly bring all of the space-time and the entire world under its control. At this point, the arbitration court could be said to have formed an incomparably close relationship with this world and truly become a part of this world. Moreover, it was a part that could even be compared to the heavenly Tao. Under such circumstances, if the arbitration court was still exposed to the outside world, as before, and still directly opened its existence to the many creatures without reservation, it was equivalent to opening the depths of this world to the endless creatures. Even if this world was willing, ordinary creatures wouldn't be able to bear it. For example, now the arbitration court was still incomplete, but they could already naturally accept the emotions of the arbitration judge and receive all kinds of information contained in the arbitration judge. If they waited until the arbitration judge and the arbitration court truly reached perfection, the information and emotions that emerged would probably skyrocket by tens of thousands of times. In this way, even they would feel immense pressure as they watched the scene unfold before them. If it was an ordinary cultivator or living being who saw this, they might immediately explode and die a horrible death. It was impossible for such a state to appear. Therefore, it was only reasonable for the arbitration court to directly disappear like the heavenly Tao after this. Just as Shu Si was thinking about this, the many guardians also sighed inwardly, seemingly understanding many things. Their sighs were filled with regret, understanding, and an indescribable excitement. At this moment, an indescribable fluctuation began to appear from all directions and quickly gathered toward the core of this world, the arbitration court, or more specifically, the arbitration judge. The source of these fluctuations was clearly the end of this world. Judging from the size of this world, the speed at which they could gather in the arbitration court from all directions in such a short time was already billions of times faster than the speed of light. This unimaginably fast ripple instantly caused all the living beings and cultivators in this world to feel as if their bodies and minds were undergoing some sort of inexplicable baptism. In a trance, they seemed to feel some kind of change in this world. At the same time, those creatures seemed to be attracted by some invisible force. They naturally turned their gazes towards the core of this world, where the arbitration court was located. At this moment, no matter how strong or weak their bodies were, no matter how strong or weak their eyesight was, they all saw the arbitration court that was billions of kilometers away from them in an instant. They even saw the indomitable arbitration judge at the center of the arbitration court. In the hearts of countless creatures, the image of the arbitration judge was different. They all appeared in the most fair, orderly, and dignified appearance that they believed to be. At this moment, countless creatures felt an indescribable feeling emerge from the bottom of their hearts, arbitration judge. This was the thought that naturally appeared in the hearts of countless creatures. Chapter 2173. An unimaginable ripple spread out in all directions from where the arbitration court was. In the blink of an eye, it had swept through the entire world, causing all living beings, all existences, and all things in the world to undergo a subtle change. In a trance, all the indescribable emotions they felt before disappeared without a trace. Even their memories of the arbitration court and the arbitration judge were gradually erased as if they had never existed. It seemed that the arbitration court now possessed a characteristic that mortals couldn't see, sense, or remember. This was a characteristic that only the primal chaos possessed. At this moment, the numerous guardians clearly sensed that above their heads, where the heavenly Tao was supposed to be, an indescribable existence had appeared. This existence vaguely coexisted with the heavenly Tao and had all kinds of subtle conflicts with it. The indescribable existence seemed to want to bring the heavenly Tao into its control, and the heavenly Tao seemed to want to bring the indescribable existence into its control. At this moment, the two of them were carrying out some kind of incomprehensible conflict outside the range of the senses of all living beings. In that conflict, endless fluctuations, endless destruction, and endless death, conflict. An inexplicable hesitation appeared on Shu Si's face at this moment. This kind of conflict was not in her imagination. She originally thought that the arbitration court would coexist with the heavenly Tao and could even obtain the support of the heavenly Tao, becoming a way for the heavenly Tao to implement itself. But she didn't expect that things would turn out like this. The arbitration court actually wanted to override the heavenly Tao, and the heavenly Tao was even more unwilling to let it do so. Man can triumph over nature. At this moment, an indescribable heroic feeling arose in the hearts of the guardians. This kind of pride came from finally seeing the heavenly Tao for the first time, from finally seizing the opportunity to defeat the heavenly Tao for the first time, and from finally discovering for the first time that they could win against the heavenly Tao. It must be known that the arbitration court's emergence from nothing was fundamentally due to them. Under such circumstances, if the arbitration court was still above the heavenly Tao and was able to bring the heavenly Tao into their control and judgment, then it was equivalent to them defeating the heavenly Tao and obtaining a power that even the heavenly Tao could not restrict. This was clearly equivalent to them achieving the state where man could conquer the heavens. With such thoughts in mind, the many guardians revealed nervous expressions. All of them looked at the void in the sky, and their eyes flashed with indescribable anticipation. You must succeed. This was the deepest hope in their hearts. However, there were quite a few protectors who still felt worried in their hearts. This worry was none other than the pseudo-heavenly Tao. It must be known that the pseudo-heavenly Tao only retreated and did not disappear. Under such circumstances, the heavenly axiom had undergone such a drastic change, and the court of arbitration that could fight against the heavenly axiom had even appeared. Could the pseudo-heavenly axiom really miss this opportunity? Among them, Shu Si, who had seen the most, was far more vigilant than all the other guardians. She looked at the heavenly Tao above the void with an indescribable fear in her eyes. If the arbitration court is controlled by the pseudo-heavenly Tao, wouldn't what we do be helping the evildoer? This thought emerged in her mind at this moment. As this thought appeared, for the first time, she doubted whether she and the other guardians had made the right move in creating the arbitration court. It must be known that the pseudo-heavenly Tao was enough to appear and almost completely overturn the entire world. If he could obtain the assistance of the arbitration court, it was hard to imagine just how strong the power he could unleash would be. I just hope that things won't develop to that point. No, it definitely won't develop to that point. This arbitration court is different from the heavenly Tao. Its existence seems to be completely rooted in us guardians. It's completely rooted in our will. Such an existence absolutely can't be subverted so easily, even if it's the pseudo-heavenly Tao. Moreover, the pseudo-heavenly Tao has already been greatly damaged by his attack. He may not be able to spare the strength to meddle in the affairs of the arbitration court. Shu Si thought in her heart. Her expression gradually changed from hesitation and fear to determination. At this moment, some kind of subtle vibration suddenly emerged from the heavenly Tao. This subtle vibration was so strange. After it appeared, it instantly penetrated space and time. In the blink of an eye, it had already arrived above the arbitration court and rushed straight toward it. The vibration seemed to be a simple vibration, but it also seemed to contain some kind of unimaginable substance and some kind of earth-shattering terrifying power. The guardians couldn't be more familiar with this kind of existence. That was the manifestation of the origin of the guardian platform. Damn it! He really made a move. At this moment, Shu Si's face showed a horrified expression. The arbitration court was formed after tens of millions of years of development by the many guardians and the origin of the guardian platform. Compared to the past, it had certainly strengthened to an unimaginable level and possessed unimaginable power. But in essence, it was still the same as before. There was still no change. In other words, even if a new origin appeared, it would still accept the new origin and absorb it into its body, becoming a part of itself. And at this moment, the vibration that appeared from the heavenly Tao was obviously an existence similar to the origin. As for the owner of the origin, was there a need to say more? Shu Si made a prompt decision at this moment. She activated the platform formed by the tens of millions of guardian platforms under her feet. An incomparably huge source energy rushed out from the platform like a long rainbow and rushed into the sky. In the blink of an eye, it had already crossed the endless space-time and appeared directly in front of the tremor. Finally, before the tremor was about to enter the arbitration court, it blocked in front of it. Gotcha! An earth-shattering thunderclap erupted from the moment the two collided. Immediately afterward, heaven and earth collapsed, and the world was destroyed. Endless destructive shock waves began to release in all directions. Countless heaven and earth, space-time, and rules were completely destroyed in this process. This destructive light directly surpassed the original extraordinary characteristics of the heavenly Tao and the arbitration court. It directly broke through space-time, emerged in the sky, and descended from the sky, directly pouncing on the entire world. At this moment, it was like there was an additional sun in the sky. A destructive light swept across, causing everything in the sky, whether it was heaven and earth, space-time, rules, or even other invisible and intangible existences, to completely collapse in this process. What is this? Is the world going to be destroyed? At this moment, the many guardians were horrified. The pseudo-heavenly Tao has appeared again. At this moment, Shu Si's roar passed into the ears of countless guardians through a mysterious power, causing them to be extremely shocked, and fear appeared in their eyes. Then why don't you ask him to make a move? How can we stop the pseudo-heavenly Tao? At this moment, many guardians shouted one by one. The him they were talking about was naturally Luo Fan. If I could ask him to make a move, I would have done so a long time ago. He's not our slave, so when can he make a move is something we can influence. Shu Si roared again at this moment. At this moment, she wanted Luo Fan to make a move more than any other guardian. After all, as long as Luo Fan made a move, no matter what means the pseudo-heavenly Tao had, no matter what conspiracy it had, it would never succeed. However, at this moment, Luo Fan was simply like amber at the side. She couldn't even communicate with him, so how could she ask him to make a move? It could be said that at this moment, because Luo Fan didn't make a move, the one who felt the most pressure was not the other guardians, but Shu Si. In this way she was much more displeased than the other guardians, so how could she have any good words for them at this time? At this moment, those guardians showed expressions of despair on their faces. Don't be afraid, we already have the arbitration court. As long as we're willing, we can definitely get the arbitration court to deal with the pseudo-heavenly Tao. A guardian shouted at this moment. That's right, quickly ask the arbitration judge to make a move. Another guardian quickly echoed. It's impossible now. The arbitration judge has an even more powerful opponent now. A guardian directly interrupted their blind optimism and shouted. This sentence instantly woke all the guardians up from their blind optimism, causing despair to appear on their faces. That's right, now, the arbitration judge and the arbitration court were competing with the heavenly Tao for status. If the arbitration court succeeded, they would have achieved man-conquering nature. From then on, they would no longer be restricted by the heavenly Tao and would obtain fairness above the heavenly Tao. However, if the arbitration court failed, the arbitration court would be under the control of the heavenly Tao, and the fairness and order they obtained would only be under the control of the heavenly Tao. Although this was still a lot stronger than before, it was still far from what they expected to be able to protect this world under the upheaval of the heavenly Tao and maintain the basic order and stability of this world. We must not give up, we can only deal with the pseudo-heavenly Tao ourselves. We have no way out. Shu Si hurriedly shouted at this moment. At this moment, in the void outside the arbitration court, the result of the conflict between the tens of millions of guardian platforms under Shu Si's feet and the source that rushed out of the heavenly Tao gradually emerged. That shock was many times stronger than the source of the guardian platforms, and in terms of quantity, it was much more than the source of the rainbow. Under such a situation, even though the clash had caused an earth-shattering commotion and even caused absolute destruction, it still couldn't stop the tremors. In the end, it only managed to weaken the tremors by more than half before it completely dissipated. "Hurry up and attack!" Shu Si roared. At this time, the Guardians roared one by one. Streaks of light shot up from the Guardian platforms under their feet and rushed towards the arbitration court in the void. They rushed towards the powerful source that was still rushing towards the arbitration court. Those were also the source of the Guardian platforms. However, compared to the huge source of the platform formed by the tens of millions of Guardian platforms that Shu Si released, each source was countless times weaker. It seemed that they could barely form the shape of a rainbow, but they couldn't achieve the brilliance that Shu Si released. However, there were hundreds of billions of rays of light. When they were gathered together, the amount of source energy was several times greater than the source energy that Shu Si had summoned. This source wasn't limited by time and space. Almost without the passage of time, he had already arrived outside the court of arbitration and collided with the strand of origin that had rushed out from the heavenly Tao. Rumble! 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 Earth-shattering thunderclaps continuously erupted from the void at this moment. The terrifying commotion directly tore the void apart and appeared between the heavens and the earth. Dazzling rays of light and the aura of destruction constantly poured out. The entire scene was so tragic that it was as if hundreds of millions of experts were fighting in the void without holding back. Fortunately, the source that shot out from the heavenly Tao had been weakened by Shu Si, which allowed the source to intercept it before it rushed into the arbitration court. Also, the source wouldn't be completely destroyed the moment it came into contact with the vibration, but could achieve a certain degree of delay. Otherwise, the difference between the origin energy and the vibration was too great. No matter how many there were, it wouldn't have any effect on the vibration. It would have been broken through by the vibration and the vibration wouldn't be affected at all. It would have charged into the arbitration court without any reservation. At that time, even if they had absolute fighting spirit, even if they had the spirit to risk everything, they wouldn't be able to stop the vibration. "All of you deserve to die." At this moment, a voice came from the heavenly Tao. That voice was so strange and profound. The instant it appeared, it had already spread throughout the world, into all the space-time in this world, into all the lower layers of the world, and into the ears of all living beings. Everything could clearly hear that voice. Moreover, they could clearly feel the almost absolute killing intent contained in this voice. This killing intent was so strong that ordinary living beings couldn't bear it. In an instant, it was unknown how many billions of living beings fell into a state of mental collapse because of this voice. Along with this change, the heavenly Tao slightly surged, and an indescribably terrifying power was released from it. This power directly turned the voice that came from the heavenly Tao into a miserable shriek. Soon after, the origin that charged out from the heavenly Tao started to gradually distort, as if something had been extracted from it, or as if it had lost control of its will. It became much stiffer. Under this change, the origin released by the protectors naturally grasped this opportunity. In an instant, the endless impact directly struck the origin, causing it to continuously collapse. Tiny strands of origin were constantly being twisted and dispersed into the void. They were greedily devoured by the void in just a blink of an eye. The origin had been weakened by more than half. The remaining half was less than a fifth of its original strength. With such a quantity, even if the quality was many times stronger than ordinary origins, it could no longer suppress the origins that were guided by the numerous guardians. For a time, under the impact of the numerous origin, the strand of origin started to collapse and be destroyed. It became smaller and weaker. Fortunately, he asked for it. Otherwise, things wouldn't have been so simple. At this moment, Shu Si showed a relaxed and pained expression. The reason for the lightning changes just now was because the pseudo-heavenly Tao couldn't suppress its anger and directly poured its killing intent into the world without holding back. It must be known that even if it was an ordinary protector, if he released his killing intent without holding back, it would be enough to make billions of living beings collapse and die. Moreover, this was a pseudo-heavenly Tao that far surpassed the protectors. When it released its killing intent without holding back, the impact it caused was more than 1,000,000,000 times stronger than that of an ordinary protector. In other words, his words and his murderous intent had, in fact, killed billions and trillions of living beings. It was so much so that it had already destroyed an unknown number of trillions of quadrillions of heaven and earth, an unknown number of trillions of quadrillions of worlds. Chapter 2174. After all, the death of living beings would produce resentment. This resentment was only emitted by the death of every living being. It was insignificant to existences at the level of the guardians, and it was almost negligible to the pseudo-heavenly Tao. However, there were simply too many of them. The killing intent emitted by the pseudo-heavenly Tao had destroyed billions and trillions of worlds, trillions of spacetimes, and billions of living beings in each world. The amount of resentment had obviously reached an unimaginable level, and this was already enough to affect the heavenly Tao, and then through the heavenly Tao, to affect the pseudo-heavenly Tao. The final result of all of this was that at this moment, the pseudo-heavenly Tao found it difficult to control the quintessence that it had sent out, causing the quintessence to retreat under the attacks of the guardians, and it was about to collapse completely. Although all of this developed very quickly, for existences at the level of the guardians, even an instant could be divided into billions and billions of parts by them. This bit of time was enough for them to understand everything clearly in this process. For a moment, countless guardians showed excitement on their faces. It was as if they could already see the light of victory shining on them. Because of this, their attacks also became more and more powerful, and they became more and more excited. During this process, the quintessence that came from the heavenly Tao collapsed even more quickly. Shu Si also showed a faint smile at this moment. Even in her opinion, the pseudo-heavenly Tao's plan this time had completely failed, and what awaited them next was to harvest the fruits of victory. If this bit of origin is destroyed, the arbitration court won't be damaged, but the heavenly Tao will be more or less damaged because of the damage caused by the pseudo-heavenly Tao. In this way, the arbitration court will definitely gain a greater upper hand in the battle between the arbitration court and the heavenly Tao. Perhaps the arbitration court will obtain the final victory in the end. If that's the case, thinking of this, even Shu Si's heart couldn't help but race. At this moment, just as the guardians were filled with anticipation, the origin that flew out from the heavenly Tao collapsed with a loud bang. A terrifying shock wave instantly swept out in all directions, breaking through the void and the endless obstructions. It directly descended into the normal world, sweeping away the endless spacetime and the endless world in the void, causing a vacuum that had never appeared before to appear between the heavens and the earth. The scene was so real that the guardians were shocked. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. After all, that was the fundamental structure of the world. But now, it had disappeared after being hit by the shockwave. This was simply subverting their worldview. How could they not feel incredulous? How could he believe it so easily? However, they soon discovered that all of this was really just an illusion. In the blink of an eye, they discovered that everything had returned. Space-time, heaven and earth, rules, and everything else had been completely restored. There was no longer any trace of the existence of the origin in the void, as if nothing had happened before. "What the hell is going on?" a guardian murmured, unable to understand what had happened just now. None of them would believe that it was merely a hallucination. After all, as guardians, they couldn't be more clear about what an illusion was. One had to know that the more targets the illusion worked on, the more difficult it would be. Even for guardians like them, with the help of the mysterious power, it was already considered exaggerated to be able to make all living beings in the area they guarded hallucinate. To make all the living beings in this world and all the guardians hallucinate at the same time, they couldn't imagine just how powerful such an ability had to be to achieve such a feat. If the pseudo-heavenly axiom could do all this, he wouldn't have to resort to all those schemes and conspiracies before. Wouldn't everything be solved if it directly suppressed them? Oh no, he succeeded in part. At this moment, Shu Si exclaimed with a horrified look in her eyes. She had finally figured out what had happened and understood why that almost illusory scene had appeared. In fact, the development in that instant was countless times more complicated than what all the guardians had seen and sensed. In that instant, the pseudo-heavenly Tao used its own essence and power to directly distort and change the laws and regulations of the world. In the billions and trillions of minute changes, it caused the space above space to show the rare appearance of a vacuum that many living beings had seen earlier. Then, relying on this change, he used his remaining source energy to bypass all obstructions, bypassing all defenses of the arbitration court, and directly rushed into the arbitration court. Compared to all the origin he had released before, this bit of origin was insignificant. It could even be said that if it was in front of the pseudo-heavenly Tao, it wouldn't even bend over for this bit of origin. But after all, it was a bit of the pseudo-heavenly Tao's origin. Its entry into the arbitration court meant that the pseudo-heavenly Tao had already begun to intervene in the arbitration court. The final outcome was hard to predict. That was why Shu Si said that he had succeeded in part. "What's going on?" a guardian hurriedly asked. After all, from Shu Si's words, it seemed that something very serious had happened. When Shu Si heard this, she sighed and explained her guess bit by bit. Hearing his narration, the numerous guardians fell silent one by one. An indescribable frustration emerged from the bottom of their hearts. It must be known that this time, they had gathered the full strength of all the guardians and exerted the strength they could exert to the limit. But even so, they couldn't completely block the pseudo-heavenly Tao's means. The frustration of not being able to make all the origin of the pseudo-heavenly Tao leave the arbitration court was simply an unbearable weight for the guardians. How could they not be silent? At this moment, inside the arbitration court, the arbitration judge's body began to move. In a trance, there seemed to be a bright spot in his eyes that flickered with a strange light. This strange light gave the arbitration judge a special charm at this time. It seemed that he had become even more human, and the emergence of this kind of popularity made the arbitration judge seem to have evolved to a higher level than before. However, the hearts of the guardians sank to the bottom when they sensed this change. It must be known that they built the arbitration court and the arbitration judge in order to obtain fairness and order without any selfishness. Under such circumstances, the arbitration judge actually became more popular, which meant that he had gained more autonomy and even more selfishness. In this way, could the arbitration judge still insist on being fair without any selfishness? Could he still insist on the order without any discount? Thinking of this, a subtle look of despair appeared on the faces of the guardians. At this time, they had already admitted in their hearts that their previous efforts had been a complete failure. It was so much so that it had the opposite effect. It had once again created a mountain above their heads that was suppressing them, making their future experiences even more difficult. It's not the last moment yet. At this time, Shu Si began to encourage them again. However, compared to before, no matter what she said, she could no longer get any response. The expressions of the guardians did not waver at all. Each of them was still in that half-dead state from before. Not a single one of them even swept their perception towards where Shu Si was. After all, in their view, the outcome of the current situation was already clear. In this way, what else could they do to reverse the facts? Could it be that they could directly manipulate the nature of the arbitration judge? How was that possible? It had to be said that they had created the arbitration court and the arbitration judge so that no guardian could override them. It was so that no living being could make the arbitration judge change his mind. Under such circumstances, how could they influence the arbitration judge? How could they change the mentality of the arbitration judge? Shu Si shouted for a long time, but she didn't get a response. She couldn't help but show a bitter expression. Although she hadn't found a truly effective way to stop the change of the arbitration judge, she knew that if she didn't stop it, the situation would be irredeemable. If she worked hard, there might be a chance to turn things around. Under such circumstances, she had received such a response. How could he not feel helpless about it? If this is the case, things are really irredeemable, she murmured. A trace of despair flashed in the depths of her eyes. Immediately afterward, she suddenly felt that the platform under her feet began to tremble slightly. As the guardian platform under her feet trembled, almost every other guardian felt the guardian platform they were on also trembling subtly. The tremors were rather subtle, but they were like thunderbolts exploding in the hearts of the protectors, causing their expressions to turn even uglier. This situation obviously meant that the arbitration court had begun to change its original attitude toward the guardian platforms and even the areas guarded by the guardians, and this also meant that the pseudo-heavenly Tao had truly gained the upper hand. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the heavenly Tao amber next to Shu Si, frowned slightly. Immediately afterward, a bit of consciousness separated from his body and rushed out of the amber. It appeared next to Shu Si and drew endless mysterious power into itself, transforming into a body of Luo Fan. It was the mind doppelganger that had appeared once before. Who is affecting my cultivation again? After this consciousness clone of Luo Fan appeared, he frowned and asked. The words were spoken calmly, but with the help of the trembling power of the heavenly Tao, they spread out in all directions, into the ears of all living beings who could hear, and even into the heavenly Tao itself. Even the heavenly Tao trembled a few times. You finally came out. At this moment, Shu Si only felt a ray of light dispel the darkness of despair in her heart, and her eyes became bright. Luo Fan's consciousness clone frowned. He looked up at the sky and discovered the existence of the arbitration court. His heart moved slightly, and endless information flowed through his mind. In the blink of an eye, he already understood the cause and effect. An inexplicable admiration appeared on his face. I didn't expect you to be able to do these things. Indeed, I can't underestimate anyone. What's so good about it? Now we've shot ourselves in the foot. Shu Si sighed and smiled bitterly. At this moment, her expression was much more relaxed than before. The despair hidden in the bottom of her heart had long disappeared, replaced by an indescribable anticipation and even an inexplicable excitement. Evidently, she was looking forward to Luo Fan's method of dealing with the pseudo-heavenly Tao as cleanly as before. She was also inexplicably excited about the method that Luo Fan might use next. At this moment, the mood of the many guardians who heard Luo Fan's words began to change dramatically. An inexplicable hope arose in the hearts of most guardians. They looked forward to the powerful existence that dealt with the pseudo-heavenly Tao last time to once again display his remarkable ability, dispel the despair in front of them, and restore the world to what they were originally looking forward to. Of course, there were also a small number of guardians who did not know about Luo Fan's means. At this moment, they were just shocked by the method that Luo Fan displayed to easily spread his voice throughout the world. Shot ourselves in the foot? I don't think so. Luo Fan just smiled faintly. At this moment, in the arbitration court, the arbitration judge trembled slightly. He suddenly raised his hand and inserted it into his body. With a slight grasp, an incomparably fine ray of light was pulled out and constantly struggled in his hand. As the ray of light was pulled out, the vitality in the arbitration court's eyes began to gradually fade. Not long after, it completely disappeared without a trace, and the arbitration judge completely returned to his original selfless and emotionless appearance. "It's you again." At this moment, a voice came from the heavenly Tao. There was a strong anger in the voice, but there was no killing intent. Clearly, the pseudo-heavenly Tao had learned its lesson. "Isn't it me? In order to deal with me, you really put in a lot of effort," Luo Fan said faintly. This time, his voice did not spread throughout the world, and it was not heard by the other guardians. Instead, it was transmitted into the heavenly Tao without reservation, causing it to tremble. Of course, it was only transmitted into the heavenly Tao. With his current ability, it was already very rare for him to be able to come into contact with the heavenly Tao. How could he truly distinguish the various details within the heavenly Tao and find the pseudo-heavenly Tao inside? However, he believed that as long as the pseudo-heavenly Tao existed, it naturally had a way to discover his words. Therefore, there was not much difference between sending it into the pseudo-heavenly Tao's ears. "Don't be arrogant. When I figure out what you're up to, it'll be the time of your death," the pseudo-heavenly Tao said faintly. As it spoke, the wisp of light in the arbitration judge's hand, which was the wisp of origin that the pseudo-heavenly Tao had forcibly sent into the arbitration court through the complicated changes, naturally collapsed layer by layer. In the blink of an eye, it turned into nothingness and disappeared without a trace. Hearing the words of the pseudo-heavenly Tao, Luo Fan only smiled. "I'm looking forward to you giving me enough pressure. I only hope that you don't wait until the world is destroyed before you find the confidence to make a move." As he spoke, his mind clone's eyes narrowed. Inside the arbitration court, the arbitration judge trembled slightly. He waved his hands and made an inexplicably complicated hand seal. As soon as this hand seal appeared, an eternal and indestructible charm appeared on his body. With the appearance of this charm, the arbitration court trembled slightly, and its power increased greatly. It instantly gained the upper hand in the battle against the heavenly Tao on a different level. It began to suppress the heavenly Tao, forcing it to retreat step by step. Its status also began to gradually transcend and rise, however, although it had Luo Fan's help, there was still a huge gap between Luo Fan and the heavenly Tao. Therefore, although the arbitration court obtained the last straw that broke the camel's back, it ultimately only gained the upper hand. It was already its limit to surpass the heavenly Tao by half a head. In the end, it still could not surpass the heavenly Tao, so it lacked the strength to continue and stop. As the arbitration court stabilized, Luo Fan also sighed. "This is as far as I can go." What a pity! At this moment, Shu Si was dazzled by this scene. When she heard Luo Fan's words, she exclaimed, "This is already very amazing. We originally only hoped that the arbitration court could stand side by side with the heavenly Tao. Reaching this step has far exceeded our expectations." Chapter 2175. The reason why Luo Fan was able to invade the arbitration court so easily and control the arbitration judge was because the arbitration court and the arbitration judge were composed of tens of millions of yuan of capital, which came from the Guardian platform that he had completely refined. It should be said that Luo Fan's tens of millions of yuan of capital seemed to be no different from other ordinary Guardian platforms through Shu Si. It felt like the only difference was the number. But in fact, it was only because it was in Shu Si's hands. In fact, there was a world of difference between these platforms and ordinary Guardian platforms. Although ordinary Guardian platforms had accepted the Guardians and given their control authority to the Guardians, in fact, they were still ownerless Guardian platforms after all. However, in reality, they were still ownerless Guardian platforms after all. Their true master was still this world. Those Guardians only had the authority to control these platforms. In contrast, the Guardian platforms that Luo Fan refined were completely different. The core power of these Guardian platforms had long been completely transformed into the mysterious power condensed by Luo Fan, or rather, the power of the heavenly way. In this way, the true master of these Guardian platforms naturally became Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, sending the origin of these Guardian platforms into the arbitration court and becoming part of the support foundation of the arbitration court was equivalent to directly sending Luo Fan's will into the arbitration court and becoming an important part of the arbitration judge. What was the difference between that and sending his will into the arbitration court and becoming an important part of the arbitration judge? This was completely different from the other Guardians sending their own Guardian platform's origin into it. It should be said that ordinary Guardians were not the true masters of the Guardian platforms at all. They could sense the origin, but they couldn't control or influence it at all. Sending such an origin into the arbitration court was naturally equivalent to sending a part of this world to a fixed location. It had little to do with them. It was precisely because of this that the Guardians thought that this method could achieve true fairness and order. In a way, their method could be said to be a complete failure. At the very least, compared to the goal of absolute fairness and order that they wanted to achieve, this approach was already on the wrong path from the very beginning. Of course, this was only in terms of living beings. For Luo Fan, this change couldn't be more perfect. After such a change, the arbitration court could be said to be completely under his control. If he really touched the arbitration court, it would almost mean that he would obtain the final victory. Of course, compared to the pseudo-heavenly Dao hegemon, Luo Fan was much more fortunate to be in control of the court of arbitration. At the very least, what Luo Fan needed now was to maintain the current appearance of this world and maintain the stability of the mysterious power in this world. But it was not like the pseudo-heavenly axiom, which wanted to change the development trend of this world and change the mysterious power of this world. From this point of view, the Guardians of this world were not completely defeated. Luo Fan had long understood all of this in his heart the moment he appeared. However, he clearly had no intention of saying it out loud. At this time, he only immersed himself in the connection between the various levels, constantly improving his control over the various levels, and improving the communication between the various levels. He worked hard to connect everything together so that he could use the existences corresponding to the various levels to complete his own sublimation. This process was so complicated that it was unimaginable. Even after so many years, he had only completed a small part of it. There was still a long way to go before he could truly connect all the layers together. If he continued to develop like this, it could be expected that it would take an extremely long time for him to finally complete this cultivation. Fortunately, Luo Fan was not in a hurry at this time. In any case, time was the most meaningless existence in this great calamity. Perhaps the great calamity would not be over even after hundreds of trillions of years had passed. Under such circumstances, the only thing he had to do now was not to think about anything else and just focus on cultivating. In any case, no matter what, this great calamity would inevitably push his opponents to go against him, and it would inevitably push the fate of him and the pseudo-heavenly axiom to the final battle. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not need to pay attention to other messy things at all. Luo Fan was once again completely immersed in cultivation, but the other Guardians were excited once again. All of them were rejoicing for the arbitration court and the final victory of the arbitration judge in the battle against the heavenly axiom. All of them had endless confidence in the future development of this world, and felt that they could finally enjoy the joy of victory with complete peace of mind. Under such circumstances, the atmosphere in this world finally returned to its original relaxed state. It was to the extent that they were already a little indulgent. This was inevitable. After the extreme pressure, they were naturally more relaxed and even indulgent than before. For these Guardians, under the pressure brought by the pseudo-heavenly axiom for such a long time, they even had to think twice before taking action. It went without saying how great the pressure was for them. It was even more cautious than when they were still weak and under the layers of attacks and pressure. How many billions of years had it not happened to them? Now that it had appeared for such a long time, how could they feel good about it? In this way, at this time, the arbitration court was already half a step above the heavenly axiom and could faintly suppress the heavenly axiom. They thought that there would no longer be any danger in this world. No matter what they did, no matter how tragic the battle was, it was impossible for this world to suffer irreparable damage. The previous oppression naturally rebounded at an astonishing speed. In the next tens of millions of years, the guardians in this world began to fall into the chaos before the quagmire of war broke out. Many guardians vented their dissatisfaction with the other guardians that they had accumulated over the years, and one war after another broke out among the guardians. Tens of millions of living beings, billions of living beings, billions of living beings, and even trillions of living beings were constantly slaughtered in the war. The blood, resentment, and baleful aura soared into the sky, almost covering the entire world. However, no matter what kind of blood, resentment, and baleful aura it was, when it reached a certain level, it would naturally dissipate and transform into an existence that had no influence on this world. It would fuse with this world, and finally, through the rotation of the world, it would transform into some kind of retribution, which would then act on the existence that caused all the blood, resentment, and baleful aura in this way. The war that was originally enough to cause thousands of quagmires of war in this world didn't trigger a quagmire of war in the end, nor did this world fall into any calamity. This situation was absolutely inconceivable in the past. But at this time, after tens of millions of years, it couldn't be more normal. Because in these years, the arbitration court and the arbitration judge appeared in this world. Although the arbitration court and the arbitration judge had already disappeared and appeared on the level where the heavenly Tao was, the heavenly Tao still remained. However, no matter how big or small, the arbitration court and the arbitration judge would always be involved in any dispute that occurred in this world. They were all there to control the final bottom line and protect the most fundamental order of this world. To protect the most fundamental fairness of this world. It was precisely because of this that the world was able to recover from the tragic wars over the past tens of millions of years. It did not allow the wars to expand and eventually lead to a quagmire of war that affected the entire world. It did not allow the world to once again fall into the calamity that all the protectors abhorred. On this day, Shu Si sensed that the world had fallen into complete chaos, and such a thought flashed in her mind. Did we do something wrong? When the arbitration court was built, many of the guardians thought that it was a good thing. It could keep this world away from the danger of destruction and allow this world to guard its final bottom line even in the most serious calamity. But now, after tens of millions of years of development, the guardians who still maintained a clear mind increasingly discovered that the construction of the arbitration court might not have been a wise decision. At least, the construction of the arbitration court was not entirely a good thing. After all, such a chaotic scene on this side of the world was absolutely impossible to see before the arbitration court appeared. Although the arbitration court guarded the final bottom line of this world, allowing the world to not collapse and be destroyed no matter what kind of calamity it encountered. But that was all because of the arbitration court. This world had always been in the bottom line. All the guardians had completely lost their scruples because of the existence of the arbitration court. Their desires, their hatred, were no longer being suppressed. For them, with the existence of the arbitration court, no matter what they did, there wouldn't be any problems in this world. Since that was the case, why did they have to suppress themselves? Why did they have to suffer? Why couldn't they fulfill their wishes? Why couldn't their will be clear? War was born because of this. Chaos was born because of this. Am I wrong? Am I right? Shu Si murmured. She couldn't help but look at Luo Fan, who had turned into amber, with a look of longing in her eyes. Obviously, she wanted to get the answer to her doubts from Luo Fan. Unfortunately, although tens of millions of years had passed, Luo Fan still looked the same as before. He was still quietly in the amber, and it seemed like he hadn't changed at all since tens of millions of years ago. Under such circumstances, it was obviously impossible for her to get her answer. After a long time, Shu Si let out a long sigh. She could only turn her gaze to other areas of this world, to other chaotic places, and ponder the answer she wanted. Shu Si had no intention of participating in that kind of battle, but the tree longed for peace, but the wind would not stop. She wanted peace, but it was impossible for the other guardians to keep her calm. As mentioned before, because of the existence of the arbitration court, the self-control of most guardians had been weakened to a level that was almost completely non-existent. Under such circumstances, all kinds of dissatisfaction and malice that existed in the past would naturally be magnified. As a woman, Shu Si was a guardian that many guardians didn't pay attention to. But suddenly, she stood above many guardians and became the most powerful existence among them. How could many guardians accept this generously? How could there not be any guardians who were unhappy with him, or even hostile toward her? If it were before, this kind of dissatisfaction and hostility naturally wouldn't develop and wouldn't cause any impact. However, at this time, under the situation where their desires were not restricted, this kind of dissatisfaction and hostility naturally began to expand continuously. For tens of millions of years, it was enough to strengthen this kind of dissatisfaction and hostility to the point where they took action. One day, when Shu Si was sighing inwardly, she suddenly felt all kinds of indescribable malice rushing toward her from all directions. Before she could react, she discovered that tens of billions of protective platforms had appeared around her, surrounding her in all directions, completely sealing off all her exits and directions to break out of the encirclement. "What do you want to do?" Shu Si was shocked and angry at this moment. These guardian platforms in front of her were not illusory, but real guardian platforms. They had only appeared here through various subtle changes in space and time to teleport. This kind of method was not a special ability for guardians. Almost any guardian could easily do this. At this moment, the moment these platforms were teleported here through space-time, the endless mysterious power brought by the guardian platforms naturally began to emerge from all directions, constantly pouncing toward where Shu Si was. "Your status is too high, we can't stand it." At this moment, a guardian shouted angrily. At this moment, the other guardians showed cold smiles on their faces, looking at Shu Si with eyes full of malice. Faced with such a change, how could Shu Si not understand that they had already made up their minds to kill her? At that moment, she could not be bothered to investigate the root cause of the change in the guardians. With a slight thought, endless power surged, and the guardian platform beneath her feet began to emit endless mysterious power that surged into the sky. Along with these mysterious powers, the guardian platform seemed to have suddenly turned into an illusory light and shadow. There were no changes even after being hit by the endless mysterious powers around the guardian platform. It was as if the guardian platform wasn't there and the mysterious powers had just missed their target. Faced with such a change, the expressions of the guardians did not change, as if the change in front of them was not unexpected at all. They shouted angrily, and as all the mysterious powers began to surge, they gradually linked up and formed an incredibly complicated and profound formation. It released all sorts of indescribably terrifying might, and it began to sweep through the layers of time and space, searching for the existence of Shu Si and the guardian platform beneath her feet. "Looks like you've been preparing for a long time." At this moment, Shu Si showed an extremely deep anger on her face. Part of her anger was directed at the guardians, but most of it was directed at herself. It must be known that she had been observing the changes in this world all these years, and she had even studied the battlefield and the source of the dispute. However, under such circumstances, she actually did not notice the connection between the guardians, and she did not notice that the Guardians had been planning to deal with her since a long time ago. To her, this was simply an unforgivable negligence, and it could almost be said to be a fatal mistake. How could she not be angry at her negligence? How could she not feel guilty for her mistake? However, no matter how negligent she was, no matter how angry she was, no matter how guilty she was not afraid at all. Even if there were tens of billions of Guardians attacking her at the same time, even if the Guardians were extremely well prepared, had almost considered all possible changes, and had almost perfectly responded to all possible responses, it was still the same. The reason was none other than the amber that was standing beside her at this very moment. It was because of the existence in the amber that was omnipotent in her heart. Chapter 2176. The Guardians were surprised by Shu Xi's calmness. After all, she was facing an attack that contained the power of tens of billions of Guardians. Even if she possessed power that surpassed ordinary Guardians by tens of millions of times, it was impossible for her to escape. In particular, they believed that if they were in Shu Xi's situation, it would be impossible for them to come out unscathed, regardless of whether their strength had increased by tens of millions or hundreds of millions of times. At this moment, the mysterious power amber beside Shu Xi trembled slightly. Suddenly, some sort of fluctuation was released from it and swept in all directions. The fluctuation was so mysterious and profound that even though the Guardians were experienced and knowledgeable, they couldn't understand the characteristics of the fluctuation. They could only know that this fluctuation instantly surpassed all space and time, directly sweeping over their bodies, sweeping over the platforms they were guarding. It was even to the extent that they had an indescribable feeling at this instant, and it was that this fluctuation had grasped all their secrets and all the trump cards they'd concealed. Shit! At this moment, the Guardians exclaimed inwardly. One had to know that for existences at their level, their greatest reliance was mystery. As long as their secrets weren't known by others, they wouldn't be in danger. At the very least, they wouldn't be in too much danger. But if their secrets were known by their enemies, then no matter how weak they were, they could still pose a threat to them. Not to mention that their enemies weren't weak existences, but terrifying existences that could wipe them out with a single move. If such existences knew their secrets, then it was equivalent to sending themselves to the other party's blade. As such thoughts flashed through their minds, the fluctuation reacted again. All the fluctuations retracted and condensed into all sorts of indescribable patterns on the amber, transforming into strands of complicated patterns. With this change, the Guardians felt their minds being pulled by an indescribable force. They completely ignored their own defenses and the countless methods they had imbued their minds with. They began to leave their bodies, traversing through space and time, and plunged into the amber. At this moment, all the Guardian platforms that besieged Shu Xi stopped. As for the protectors on the platform, they were all dumbfounded. Their eyes were blank and their bodies were stiff. It was as if they had lost their wills and turned into puppets. After this change, Shu Xi felt her body relax, and the terror that was about to descend completely disappeared in the blink of an eye. His entire body became relaxed once more. With a slight thought, the Guardian platform formed by the tens of millions of Guardian platforms had already left the strange spacetime created by the tens of millions of Guardian platforms and returned to its original position. It still controlled the area guarded by the tens of millions of Guardian platforms like before. Sure enough, nothing happened. Shu Xi thought to herself as a look of joy and helplessness appeared on her face. The result of the change before her eyes was within her expectations, but the process of the change before her eyes wasn't something she could have imagined before. One had to know that she had thought that since the Guardian platform had been greatly affected, Luo Fan would definitely split a bit of his attention to easily deal with the numerous Guardians, just like the previous 2 times. However, he did not expect that Luo Fan would be able to easily deal with the protectors. However, he did not even split a bit of his attention. It even felt like he only felt a mosquito landing on his body, so he slightly shook his muscles. And it was such a simple action that had actually directly dealt with all the protectors. Even though she knew how terrifying Luo Fan was, she was still shocked by this change. She also deeply felt that the gap between her and Luo Fan had increased once again compared to before. After the protectors' minds were sucked into the countless patterns on the surface of the amber, they seemed to have turned into ordinary people and began to be thrown into the cycle of life and death. They felt the malice of the world and the malice of reincarnation time and time again. They enjoyed the life and death of mortals and the various destructive attacks that targeted their mental weaknesses. In the beginning, the protectors were still able to guard their minds and knew their situation. They understood that they had fallen into some kind of mental attack. However, as time passed, as they reincarnated more than 1 trillion times, more than 1 trillion times, and even more than 1 trillion times, the traces left behind by the reincarnation finally shrouded the clarity in their hearts, causing them to gradually forget everything. They gradually immersed themselves in the repeated reincarnations, the repeated disillusionment. In this way, their resistance naturally became weaker and weaker. It was just a few tens of billions of minds. To Luo Fan, who was already used to this kind of attack, he could instinctively create scenes that were absolutely targeted at them, making it impossible for them to defend against him. At this moment, he did not even need to split his attention, nor did he need to interrupt his own cultivation process. He had already suppressed the protectors to the point that they no longer had any ability to resist. As their minds were suppressed, the bodies of the protectors naturally withered. The mysterious power that was drawn over by them sensed the changes in their minds and naturally began to change. It began to tremble and vaguely, it began to become chaotic. As the chaos spread out, it caused the strange spacetime created by the protectors to gradually become chaotic. Originally, the spacetime formed by the protectors was extremely stable, and they were even confident that they could imprison Shu Si and the platform formed by the tens of millions of protectors. However, as the protectors changed, this stable structure began to gradually lose its stability. All sorts of strange lights and shadows appeared in the spacetime, along with all sorts of unimaginable powers. Gradually, the spacetime seemed to have turned into a pot of porridge. Everything appeared, but nothing could be stabilized. This scene made the spacetime grow wider and wider, and the distance between the protectors grew wider and wider. At a certain moment, when this change reached a certain limit, an earth-shattering sound exploded in the depths of the spacetime. Under this sound, countless cracks appeared between the protectors, and in the blink of an eye, they covered the entire spacetime and enveloped it. Then, as the chaotic energy surged, the spacetime was instantly torn apart, and all the guardian platforms returned to their original areas, back to where they were before. Along with this change, a mysterious power began to riot and instantly tore apart most of the protectors on the protectors' platforms. Clearly, the distance was too great, and the connection between the protectors' minds and the mysterious power had been completely severed, causing the mysterious power to lose control and instinctively reject everything that did not belong to the protectors' platforms. At this moment, it was the protectors' bodies. Only a few hundreds of thousands of protectors had refined the protectors' platforms to a deeper degree, and their bodies had already resonated with the protectors' platforms. This allowed them to avoid being completely torn apart by the mysterious power. The relationship between the mind and the body was an extremely mysterious one. When the two were completely severed, there would naturally be a reaction from both. At this moment, almost all the protectors felt an indescribable pain in the depths of their hearts. Their minds, which were originally immersed in the cycle of reincarnation, suddenly had a flash of inspiration. In the blink of an eye, they found their sense of self and understood what they had experienced during this period of time, from the time their minds were thrown into the countless patterns on the surface of the amber until they recovered. Only a few short years had passed in the eyes of the outside world. But in their senses, it had already been billions and trillions of years. The torture of such a long period of time had left deep marks on their minds. Even if they had found their sense of self, they found that their minds had become extremely turbid. All sorts of inexplicable marks made them feel that their cultivation realm had greatly declined, and they had only grasped 10% of the profundities that they had comprehended in the past. More importantly, almost all of them could no longer sense the existence of their bodies, nor could they sense the existence of the protectors that had a close connection with them. They couldn't be more clear about what this situation represented. This clearly meant that they had already been completely trapped in this boundless reincarnation land of death. Who is it? Why are they treating us so viciously? A protector roared tragically towards the sky. His voice was extremely hoarse and contained endless despair. After all, the protectors were extremely powerful. Even if they were greatly restricted at this moment, even if their minds were greatly affected, they wouldn't be completely powerless. They wouldn't be like ordinary beings that had been imprisoned. At this moment, the roar directly pierced through the world of reincarnation, surpassing out and pouring into the many other worlds of reincarnation, and was heard by all living beings, including the other protectors. "We're not dealing with you. Why are you attacking us?" Another protector roared. His voice also surpassed the heavens and earth, pouring into the many other worlds of reincarnation, and was heard by all the protectors. Immediately after, voices of questioning, begging, pleading, and unwillingness continuously rang out from the various worlds of reincarnation, reverberating between the many worlds of reincarnation. Luo Fan obviously couldn't respond to all of this. It should be known that he didn't even have the slightest bit of attention to deal with the protectors' attacks. Under such circumstances, how could he be in the mood to respond to such a question? At this moment, no matter how the protectors cursed, begged, or tried to reason with him, he didn't care at all. In fact, he didn't even listen to their words at all. He just focused on his own cultivation. As the protectors continued to clamor, the worlds of reincarnation didn't stop their activities. They continued to throw them into the reincarnation cycle again and again. They continued to enjoy the malice of the world and the malice of all living beings, carving new marks on their minds time and time again. Back then, their minds were completely undamaged, but they still couldn't endure such changes. In the end, their minds were completely covered by the marks, and they fell into the worlds of reincarnation, becoming a part of them. Now, their minds were already riddled with holes. Even if they were prepared, even if they had some ability to resist, their performance couldn't be much better than before. So in the end, after millions of reincarnations, the roars grew fewer and fewer. In the end, they completely disappeared. The entire world of reincarnation, or rather, the runes, fell into silence once again. It was as if nothing had happened. The protectors had already lost their last chance to leave the worlds of reincarnation. From today onwards, unless Luo Fan was willing, they could only perish along with the worlds of reincarnation. Of course, even the weakest of the protectors was a tribulation stage powerhouse. Such powerhouses possessed an extremely high spiritual essence. Generally speaking, it would take an extremely long time to completely annihilate their spiritual essence and make them perish along with the worlds of reincarnation. The number of reincarnations required would also be extremely terrifying. At the very least, it wouldn't reach that step in a short period of time. At this moment, the arbitration court appeared out of thin air in a position slightly higher than the heavenly Tao. Shortly after, a mysterious power that surpassed the senses of all living beings and even the senses of the protectors was released. It was directed into the tens of billions of regions that had lost the protectors' spiritual essence, starting a new round of selection process for the protectors in those regions for the arbitration court, at least for the arbitration court before Luo Fan seized control of it. Fairness and order were its ultimate pursuit. For the arbitration court, those protectors didn't hold any weight at all. For them, the arbitration court and the judges wouldn't care about what happened to them. Under such circumstances, the arbitration court naturally wouldn't ignore the chaos that was about to erupt in those regions just because the protector's spiritual essence still existed. It would only start the process of making the protectors appear in those regions after seeing that there would be complete chaos if no protectors appeared. In other words, the process of the protector's selection. In this way, it would truly cut off the protector's hope of returning. As long as a new protector appeared, even if they could return, they would become homeless ghosts. The identity of the protectors would no longer have anything to do with them. After all, it was impossible for the new protectors to give up the identity of the protectors that they had already obtained for them. With the participation of the arbitration court, the selection process of the new protectors progressed at an unimaginable speed. The selection process that would have taken tens of millions of years ended in just a short million years. When the last guardian appeared, the court of arbitration finally disappeared again. And this also meant that the original protectors finally had no chance to make a comeback. All of these changes filled the hearts of the other protectors with fear. In fact, in addition to the tens of billions of protectors who participated in besieging Shu-Si, there were still countless protectors who were filled with malice towards Shu-Si. They didn't participate in this siege only because they were a little cautious in their hearts. They felt that the tens of billions of protectors were more than enough to besiege her, and there was no need for them to take risk. Under such circumstances, seeing the tens of billions of protectors fall into this kind of misfortune after besieging her, they were both afraid and glad. Each and every one of them even restrained their actions. In this way, this world seemed to be a little calmer in the past million years, and the feeling of absolute indulgence was slightly restrained. Of course, it was only a little on this day, not knowing if it was because he instinctively felt that the overall situation was set. The amber where Luo Fan was at trembled slightly. All the patterns trembled slightly and suddenly opened up. As the patterns opened up, all the world of reincarnation within collapsed. Bit by bit, their spirits were separated from the world of reincarnation, and along with the changes of the patterns, they left the patterns and appeared in the void. Bit by bit, their spirits were extremely turbid, filled with endless traces and confusion. After being released, they still couldn't react for a long time. Some of their spirits were even wailing and crying from the collapse of their world of reincarnation, cursing the heavens, cursing the existence that caused the world of reincarnation to die a horrible death. Just like this, after a long time, some of their spirits gradually recovered and began to react to what had happened. In the end, their spirits gradually became silent. The scene gradually fell into silence. Chapter 2177. Although the spirits of these former guardians had suffered countless injuries in the world of reincarnation and were riddled with holes, they no longer had their previous elegance. But in the end, they were still the spirits of the former guardians, and their levels were still there. Therefore, although they had only regained a little bit of clarity, they could clearly sense that it had only been a few million years since they fell into the world of reincarnation. A few million years was nothing compared to their hundreds of millions of years of cultivation. That was not much longer than the average person's perception of a second. In the short span of a few million years, their identities had changed from the high and mighty guardians to ghosts without a body. They had become miserable souls with no home to return to. This change was simply earth-shattering. At this moment, they didn't even dare to believe what they had sensed. They didn't dare to believe that they had fallen into such a miserable situation. Impossible! How could this happen? This must be another reincarnation. It must be. A spirit roared at this moment. The spirit contracted and suddenly expanded before exploding, forming a huge rumble that caused the surrounding space-time to be in chaos. They didn't dare to believe all of this. They would rather use their lives to fight for that tiny possibility of reincarnation. Of course, it was obvious that their deaths couldn't have been any more thorough. There weren't many of these former guardians, but that was only when compared to the tens of billions of guardians. In fact, there were millions of such guardians for a time. Loud rumbles constantly erupted around the platform, causing the spacetime around the platform to become more and more chaotic. There were even some spirits that couldn't dodge in time and were swept into the explosion, following in the footsteps of the protectors that self-destructed, falling into a situation where they died a graveless death. That's enough. At this moment, a gentle voice directly swept through all the hearts and minds, directly dispelling all the agitation in their hearts, all the chaos and destruction they had caused, completely dispelling them. In the blink of an eye, this place returned to normal and the spirits of the guardians regained clarity. At this moment, Shu Si's figure appeared in the senses of the guardians. Looking at Shu Si, these souls were all stunned, not knowing how to react. It's a good thing that you were able to escape with your lives. Next, choose an area for yourselves to cultivate. Don't get involved in the matter of the guardians. Shu Si sighed as she looked at these people, who were originally filled with endless enmity towards her, but now even their bodies had disappeared. Even the majority of their minds had been hoodwinked, and their original appearances could no longer be seen. After these guardians lost their identities as guardians, they were no longer a threat to her. Even if she were to stand there and let them attack her without any resistance, they would not be able to hurt her in the slightest. Under such circumstances, she naturally wouldn't care about what happened to the guardians. Even if she directly arranged a place for them to cultivate and arranged the best conditions for them to grow, she would not have any negative emotions. Upon hearing this strong and compassionate voice, the guardians felt all sorts of inexplicable humiliation. A soul roared, "What do you mean? Are you pitying us? Everyone, why do you have to do this? What enmity do I have with all of you? Even when we fought before, you were the ones who attacked first, right?" Shu Si only sighed. Hearing this, most of the souls fell silent. Only a small portion of souls were still unyielding, jumping up and down angrily, scolding and questioning. In short, they wanted to make Shu Si unhappy. Shu Si was naturally impatient to listen to their unreasonable behavior. With a wave of her hand, the mysterious power surged and swept away all the spirits. They were directly sent to various places in the world. If it wasn't for the mysterious power, they would have to spend a long time before they could reach the place she was looking at. With this action, she felt her surroundings clear up. Her ears calmed down again, and her mood became relaxed. After those souls were sent away by Shu Si, they truly realized that they were no longer the powerful guardians they used to be. Instead, they had become cultivators who only had their souls left. They didn't even have their bodies. An indescribable sense of defeat rose from their hearts, causing them to fall silent. After a long time, some of their souls began to gradually recover. They began to gather the endless power around them to rebuild their bodies and condense their own figures. For existences at this level, even if they had a bit of essence, they could easily derive and condense everything else, let alone a complete soul. The action of condensing their bodies did not even consume any energy for them. Let's go. From now on, cultivate well. The matters of the guardians have nothing to do with me anymore. After most of the guardians regained their consciousness, the cultivation realm that they had cultivated for billions of years began to allow them to see through all sorts of things that they couldn't see through in the past. However, there were still some guardians who couldn't see through it. After condensing their bodies, they began to plan how to become a guardian again and obtain the power to fight against Shu Si again. There weren't many of such guardians, but there were still hundreds of thousands of them. From now on, they would move from one region to another, devising one conspiracy after another to pull down the original guardians and replace them. Of course, most of them couldn't succeed. Millions of years would just be a waste. However, some of the former guardians had brilliant methods after all. In addition, they had been guardians for too long, and they understood guardians too well. Finally, their scheme succeeded. In an impossible situation, they pulled down the guardian of a certain region and replaced him, succeeding in ascending. The number of such guardians was even rarer. In total, there were only over 20 of them. At this point, the matter of tens of billions of guardians besieging Shu Si could be considered to have truly come to an end. In the end, out of tens of billions of guardians, only over 20 were able to escape. After this incident, they were still guardians. After these guardians regained their positions, they no longer provoked Shu Si. Instead, they began to recuperate and cultivate hard. It wasn't like what they had thought before they became guardians again. After becoming guardians, they would perish together with Shu Si. The reason for this was very simple. It was because these guardians were actually quite clear in their hearts that it was almost a miracle that they could become guardians again. If it wasn't for the goal of perishing together with Shu Si in their hearts, this miracle wouldn't have succeeded. Therefore, before becoming guardians again, these guardians were naturally able to get rid of all their distracting thoughts. They just guarded their will to perish together with Shu Si. However, after they became guardians, the miracle had been completed. They finally regained their rationality and truly understood that they had succeeded. Under such circumstances, they finally completely understood how big the gap between themselves and Shu Si was. In this case, how could they possibly go straight to their deaths? After all, they had worked hard, overcome all difficulties, and even fought their way out of the impossible to become the new guardians. How could they not cherish such an achievement? How could they abandon it so easily? Just thinking about it was enough to abhor them. How could they do it? It was precisely because of this that they seemed to have become completely different people after becoming guardians. However, although they didn't carry out such an action now, this thought had already been deeply engraved in their hearts. If they had a plan in the future, they would definitely carry it out again. Shu Si didn't care about the guardians' thoughts and their efforts at all. After millions of years, although she hadn't completely forgotten those conflicts back then, they could no longer leave any traces in her heart. At this moment, she had already placed her mind, her vision, her perception, and even all the factors that she could comprehend and cultivate on the mysterious power amber that had existed by her side for many years. Millions of years ago, after Luo Fan easily dealt with the guardians through the little changes in the amber, Shu Si had already realized the abnormality of the amber. In fact, this was also a very easy thing to think of. If it was an ordinary amber, even if it was condensed from the mysterious power, how could it withstand the bombardment of an existence like Shu Si? How could Shu Si not be shaken even after using all her means, even if she added in the power of the heavenly way? It could be said that this situation alone was enough to tell that the amber was absolutely extraordinary. However, Shu Si had always been able to cultivate and comprehend far too many things. The area that she needed to control was far too vast. That was why she had neglected the things that these facts represented. Millions of years ago, when Luo Fan easily used the amber to completely deal with the guardians, Shu Si finally lifted the fog that had covered her mind. She suddenly understood what she had overlooked in the past. After that, Shu Si began to turn her gaze away from the outside world. Instead, she directly looked at the amber that was condensed from the power of the heavenly way around Luo Fan. Back then, after she released the minds of the guardians, the mysterious patterns on the amber had completely disappeared. The entire amber seemed to have completely recovered its original natural appearance, and nothing special could be seen. However, to Shu Si, who had already realized the abnormality of the amber, she could no longer conceal her knowledge. She used her cultivation realm to observe the shape of the amber, to examine its structure, and to experience all the details contained within it. She hoped that she could find what she was looking for, the mysteries that would help her cultivation realm in the first tens of thousands of years. She did not gain anything. She only felt that she had become extremely familiar with the amber. She felt that even if she completely gave up on all her other memories, the shape of the amber would still be deeply engraved in the depths of her heart. However, as time passed, as she became more and more familiar with the amber, on a certain day, tens of thousands of years later, all the information and structure of the amber in her heart suddenly scattered, then suddenly reconstructed, forming an unprecedented, incomparably strange structure. This structure seemed to be the same as the amber, as if there was no difference at all. However, as long as one took a closer look, they would discover that the amber was completely different from before. It was like two completely different individuals. This situation was like the same thing suddenly changing from a different angle, causing it to display a charm that it did not have before. At that moment, Shu Si knew that her comprehension had greatly improved. For a moment she was inwardly excited, and began to carefully comprehend the amber that had undergone a subtle change. After that subtle change, the amber seemed to have become much more intimate with her. As she comprehended it, the mysteries within it began to endlessly manifest. Strands of extremely profound information continuously appeared within it, and she received them. This feeling was indescribably familiar to her. It was extremely similar to the feeling when she directly threw herself into the heavenly way and endured the endless information from the heavenly way. After discovering this, Shu Si was even more overjoyed. She wholeheartedly threw herself into comprehending the amber. After all, this kind of change was enough to show that the amber's essence had already far surpassed her level over the tens of millions of years. This kind of change had been constantly happening. From the very beginning until now, she felt that the information that had appeared from the amber and poured into her body was actually not the slightest repetition. Moreover, there was still no end to it. It was as if what she had received over the years was only an insignificant portion of the overall information. It must be known that the information that she had received over the years was already tens of thousands of times more than what she had received from the heavenly way back then, after the tens of millions of years of changes. At this moment, in Shu Si's eyes, the heavenly way's power amber was already completely different from before. Back then, the amber was just an ordinary amber in her eyes. Even if it was somewhat profound, she could only sense it with her extraordinary eyes and senses. But now, in her eyes, the amber in front of her seemed to have turned into billions of amber stacked on top of each other. Each of these amber phantoms was incomparably mysterious and mystical. Every phantom seemed to be the original amber, but they had undergone certain distortions according to a method that she could not understand. Behind this distortion, she could sense that there were even deeper and more mysterious mysteries hidden within. However, no matter how much she dug and tried to comprehend it, she could not figure out what it was. This kind of change in perspective was happening at every moment. In her senses, it was as if there were more phantoms on the amber at every moment. It was as if she was improving at every moment, and could see more secrets. It was also as if the amber was really changing at every moment. Every moment, there were more angles being created, and more profound mysteries were being born. To Shu Si, this situation was clearly the first one after all, even after millions of years, even after receiving so much information, the amber was still so unfathomable and incomprehensible in her eyes. Under such circumstances, how could she think that she had exhausted the mysteries of the amber? How could she think that the amber was really changing when she saw the changes? I never thought that he would actually be so powerful. This is even more profound than the heavenly way. This thought suddenly flashed through Shu Si's mind as she entered a state of comprehension again. At this moment, her admiration for Luo Fan had long since broken through the horizon. She had even vaguely raised Luo Fan to the level of the heavenly way. This meant that if it had been millions of years ago, before she had comprehended the amber, and if Luo Fan were to go up against the heavenly way, she would definitely think that it was impossible for Luo Fan to win, and that he would definitely lose. But now, after millions of years of comprehension, if Luo Fan were to go up against the heavenly way again, she could no longer be certain that Luo Fan would lose, and that the heavenly way would win. This was the meaning of her change in perspective. It was precisely because of this that, to her, comprehending the mysteries of the amber was equivalent to comprehending the mysteries of the heavenly way. Chapter 2178. Over the past millions of years, the situation in this world had become much better than before. As Luo Fan easily got rid of the tens of billions of guardians, the guardians finally came to a realization. Even with the arbitration court, there were still countless forces that could easily destroy them. If they accidentally came into contact with this force, the fate of those guardians would be their end in the future. Under such circumstances, even the boldest and most unscrupulous guardian couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Before making any decisions, they would obviously think about whether they would accidentally touch a force that they couldn't resist. As long as they thought about it, they would naturally restrain themselves. And as these guardians restrained themselves, the chaotic scene in this world naturally began to weaken. This could be said to be an unexpected gain, but it could also be said to be an inevitable result. After all, the guardians were guardians. They could indulge themselves for a period of time, but it was obviously impossible for them to indulge themselves forever. However, all of this was completely meaningless to Shu Si, who was originally paying attention to all of this. Under the attraction of the amber, everything in this world became less and less meaningful to her. Her cultivation realm also continued to sublimate and improve. Just like that, time passed by slowly. 1,000,000 years, 10,000,000 years, 100,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years, 10,000,000,000 years, unknowingly, 300 billion years had passed. Over the past 300 billion years, this world had already returned to its previous peace. The chaos that had arisen because of the arbitration court had completely calmed down. The fairness and order brought by the arbitration court had truly become the deep rules of this world, causing this world to be more stable and peaceful than before the arbitration court was established. Of course, all of this was more meaningful to ordinary cultivators, ordinary creatures, and ordinary civilizations. For ordinary guardians, all of this didn't have much meaning. After all, it was only 300 billion years. For many guardians, it was just the time for them to go into seclusion and cultivate a few times. But it wasn't that long. In such a short period of time, it was naturally impossible for them to make any incredible changes. At most, they would only be more familiar with the rules under the control of the arbitration court and be able to find more places to use in these rules. Even their cultivation realm didn't improve much because of this. But obviously, this didn't include Shu Si. After 300 billion years, she had come into contact with the amber and sensed the endless mysteries and principles contained within it. To her, this was simply an earth-shattering improvement. The current her cultivation realm had already risen to a level that was unimaginable in the past. She had vaguely reached the level of a third tribulation powerhouse. It must be said that before this, she was at most a tribulation powerhouse. Compared to a third tribulation powerhouse, she was billions of times weaker. Under such circumstances, in just a short period of 300 billion years, she had already crossed countless limits and reached the level of a third tribulation powerhouse. This kind of improvement was so great that any cultivator would find it unbelievable if they knew about it. And this kind of improvement directly appeared on Shu Si, and it appeared extremely naturally without any difficulty. Even her foundation wasn't damaged at all. This kind of harvest was so great that even when Shu Si occasionally thought about it, she couldn't help but feel excited and shocked. Compared to the many guardians in this world, the strength of a third tribulation powerhouse was already at the peak. In other words, if Shu Si could stand at the peak of the guardians in the past, it was because she had the tens of millions of guardian platforms constructed by Luo Fan. But now, after 300 billion years, she was able to rely on her own strength to stand at the highest peak. It could be said that at this moment, even if she only had a single guardian platform, she could easily obtain the position she had in the past and directly obtain the highest position among the many guardians. Apart from the progress of her cultivation realm, the biggest gain that Shu Si had obtained in the past 300 billion years was that she could vaguely feel the existence of other levels that belonged to her. The level that I'm currently at is only a very, very small part of my concept. there are countless times more hidden in the various levels. This was the most subversive understanding that she had obtained in the past 300 billion years. And the source of this understanding, of course, came from the amber that Luo Fan was in. After all, over the years, she had been feeling the scenes reflected by the different levels of the heavenly Tao. She was actually coming into contact with the different mysteries of the different levels at every moment. Under such circumstances, it couldn't be more normal for her to obtain such gains after 300 billion years. However, it was clear that Shu Si could sense the existence of the various levels that belonged to her indirectly by relying on Luo Fan's realm. Therefore, being able to vaguely sense it was already the limit of what she could do. However, she was simply unable to do what Luo Fan did. Using her will, her mind and body to control and adjust the existence corresponding to her in each of the levels. Not to mention that he had to communicate with different planes and expand his own essence. Therefore, although there was such a huge gain, and although her cultivation realm had increased by hundreds of millions of times compared to the past, however, compared to before, Shu Si clearly felt how insignificant she was. She felt that the road ahead of her was very long. It was precisely because of this that her interest in the various changes in this world became less and less. In fact, even if some guardians came to ask her to participate in a certain league of defender over the years, she wasn't interested in participating and directly rejected them. If this continues, after countless years, I will definitely be able to rise to a height that I can't even imagine now, and even obtain the ultimate transcendence. At a certain moment, this thought flashed through Shu Si's mind. With this thought in mind, her expression changed slightly. At this moment, a long river suddenly appeared in the void. This long river had no beginning and no end. As soon as it appeared, it had already covered the entire world and shrouded the entire world under its shadow. The aura that the long river emitted was extremely profound and mysterious. It seemed to contain all the mysteries of the universe, as well as the cultivation paths of all guardians. It contained all the principles and mysteries that all living beings could imagine and could not imagine. This is the pseudo-heavenly way. At this moment, Shu Si suddenly reacted, and her expression became extremely ugly. Although it was completely different from before, the long river in front of her gave her an extremely familiar feeling. It was the aura of the pseudo-heavenly way that she had come into contact with once before. You still haven't given up. Shu Si let out a muffled groan. With a thought, rays of light suddenly shot into the sky from the protective platform beneath her, brazenly charging towards the river. The moment it rushed over, the ray of light constantly changed in the void and gradually became illusory. It felt as if it had entered another time and space, or to be more precise, another plane. It used the other time and space or plane as a transit point, turning back from time to time. That was why it seemed to appear and disappear at the same time. The ray of light transcended time and space, and the instant the river was formed, it had already poured into the river. At this moment, the long river rolled slightly, and a muffled groan came from within. Your strength is much weaker than before. With this groan, the ray of light suddenly collapsed. The speed at which it collapsed surpassed the speed at which it was transmitted, and it directly traced back to the platform beneath Shu Si's feet. In the blink of an eye, it once again pressed down on the platform beneath Shu Si's feet, causing the platform to violently shake and show signs of collapsing. You're actually him? At this moment, such a voice rang out from the long river. It's not him, but you can actually make the same attack. Could it be that he has been nurturing you all these years? The ray of light just now contained endless power and endless unimaginable might. During the process of its attack, it constantly surpassed this plane of reality, constantly moving between many planes, and obtained power that surpassed what it should possess. After it entered the long river, its target locked onto the concept that Shu Si had comprehended the most, the concept that blasted towards the long river's existence concept. Of course, Shu Si could only vaguely sense the various planes, after all. Her attack against the concept of existence was extremely scattered, and the strength of the attack couldn't bring out the limit of the ray of light's power. Therefore, compared to any attack that Luo Fan had launched against the concept of existence, it was much weaker. Even though this attack could be said to be the limit of Shu Si's attack. If such an attack had appeared in front of the Long River for the first time, it would have naturally suffered a great loss, and it might even have been seriously injured. However, at this moment, the Long River had already experienced Luo Fan's targeted attack and had already thought of a way to deal with it. It didn't seem to pose any threat at all. Therefore, it was able to shatter the ray of light so easily and even directly attack the platform Shu Si was sitting on. At this moment, a palm appeared beside Shu Si and directly grabbed the collapsing ray of light, completely blocking all the destructive power contained in the ray of light. With a slight tremble, all the power disappeared, and the platform, which was constantly shaking due to the backlash, naturally came to a stop. This palm appeared directly from the void, as if it had been born naturally from the void. Shu Si's eyes lit up when she saw this palm, and she instinctively looked at the amber that she had been staring at for more than 300 billion years. At this moment, she saw an unimaginable scene. She saw that in the amber, the scene that she was incomparably familiar with had disappeared. She didn't know when Luo Fan had disappeared from the amber. That piece of amber that was originally incomparably profound in her eyes, that she felt as if she could comprehend it for billions of trillions of years without being able to fully comprehend it, seemed to have lost all of its profundities and mysteries. It had become an extremely ordinary piece of amber that was condensed from the energy of the heavenly Tao. He's out? Shu Si was both excited and disappointed at this moment. Naturally, she was excited because Luo Fan's appearance meant that the strength of their side would increase by tens of thousands of times. It also meant that the pseudo-heavenly way, which filled the entire world and used its own shadow to suppress the world, had an extremely low chance of winning. But she was disappointed because Luo Fan's departure made it impossible for her to continue the cultivation process that she had been familiar with for more than 300 billion years. From now on, she would no longer be able to find such a convenient cultivation method while she was filled with complicated emotions. A sneer came from the river above, which was also the pseudo-heavenly way. "Come, let me see how much progress you've made over the years. I've already found a way to deal with you." "Found a way to deal with me? I think you've completely lost your confidence. You know that if you don't act now, you'll never be my match in the future." A calm voice echoed in the void. The voice was so calm and indifferent, but it contained such unfathomable mysteries. After it appeared, it spread across the entire world in the blink of an eye, allowing all living beings, all guardians, and even objects without any spirituality to easily hear its voice and even understand its words. At this moment, the river began to churn slightly. As it churned, the heavenly way appeared above it. Compared to before, the heavenly way had changed once again. Its appearance had vaguely transformed into the shape of the river. Although it was slightly different from the river below, the similarity had reached an unimaginable level. At this moment, the arbitration court appeared and a huge figure slowly walked out from the arbitration court. That figure's face was blurry, and so was his figure. However, one could only tell that the size of his body had already reached an inconceivable level. At this moment, his blurry face started to squirm and gradually turned into a face that no one dared to imagine. A face that was exactly the same as Luo Fan. At this moment, the palm that appeared in front of Shu Si disappeared. At the same time, the hand that disappeared from the arbitration judge's hand reappeared on his wrist. "You? How could you do this?" A voice came from the river. This was also the doubt that arose in the hearts of many guardians. It must be known that the arbitration judge was a completely fair and orderly arbitration judge. All along, the arbitration court and the arbitration judge had done the same thing as when they were first constructed. They wholeheartedly guarded the world and wholeheartedly stabilized the order of this world. But now, this incomparably fair and orderly existence had transformed into the appearance of an expert that they were incomparably familiar with. This was simply a direct slap to their faces. Could it be that all our hard work back then was for this day? Some guardians couldn't help but have this thought. Some guardians even felt inexplicable despair. In his heart, he even suspected that all of his actions, and thoughts were under the control of the other party. Was everything under the other party's complete control? Luo Fan naturally couldn't pay attention to them now. Just now, when he left the Amber, he had already sent his body into the arbitration court and directly used the mysterious power that belonged to him in the arbitration court, or rather, the power of the heavenly way, to directly integrate into the arbitration judge and completely control the arbitration judge. The arbitration court had experienced more than 300 billion years of development and had improved countless times compared to the past. Back then, the arbitration court was barely higher than the heavenly Tao, but now, the arbitration court was truly above the heavenly Tao. This was especially the case when the heavenly Tao had clearly been changed by the river. It was no longer the same as it was back then. It was precisely because of this that he replaced the arbitration judge at this time and controlled all the power of the arbitration court. After all, his current opponent had fused with the heavenly way and directly transformed the heavenly way through some means, making the heavenly way almost completely listen to his will. If he were to rely on his own strength to fight against the heaven's way, then what was the difference between that and directly fighting against the world? Not to mention that he might not be able to do it. Even if he could, the consumption would be too great and the pressure would be too terrifying. Under such circumstances, controlling the arbitration court and the arbitration judge was obviously the best choice. Chapter 2180. In this way, the pseudo-heavenly Tao's attack was similar to the original attack when it was condensed. After all, every level was enduring the attack, and every level was also distributing the attack to the other levels. In this way, the pseudo-heavenly Tao's corresponding existence on a certain level had to endure the attacks from countless levels to form an overall attack. In this way, this attack was naturally not much different from the individual attacks that were condensed together. However, because of the difference between dispersion and condensation, the effect of this attack was greatly reduced, and the corresponding existence on each level of the pseudo-heavenly Tao could easily endure it. Just like this time, this attack that targeted the concept of existence seemed to be able to easily erase the pseudo-heavenly Tao's concept of existence. However, because of the dispersion, the pseudo-heavenly Tao's concept of existence was only slightly shaken, and not a single bit of damage was left on the concept of existence. For Luo Fan, this kind of situation was obviously not surprising. Seeing that this situation was not working, he retracted his palm and instantly slapped forward. His palm went deep into the void, deep into the depths of space-time, and entered another level. This time, the level he entered was not all the levels that he could come into contact with, but an individual level that was directly condensed on the concept level. The power of this slap was superimposed with the power of all the levels that he could control, or rather, communicate with. With the superposition of this power, the effect of his slap had already reached an unknown number of times greater than what his original slap could achieve. This was also a mysterious method that he had obtained after communicating with many levels. It must be known that all levels were parallel, and could even be said to be completely independent of each other. Therefore, every attack could actually be said to cover all levels. No matter who it was, even if it was an ordinary person without any power, the attack on others actually happened on all levels at the same time. The reason why the effect only manifested in the real world and not in other planes was because the vision of ordinary living beings, or in other words, their views, thoughts, and worldviews were all limited to the real world, and they had no understanding or recognition of other planes. Under such circumstances, the attack that could produce an effect on the reality level might not even have any effect on the target because there was no corresponding change in other levels. Naturally, it would not produce any effect. In contrast, existences like Luo Fan, who had already manipulated and controlled all levels, were completely different. This was because he had already completely understood the profoundness of each level, and had already completely manipulated the corresponding existences in each level. Therefore, every time he attacked, he would naturally carry out corresponding changes, and the effect of this attack would naturally be converted into a state that was relatively effective even if it was not the most effective in the corresponding level. This was the fundamental reason why existences like Luo Fan could attack all levels at the same time, and could even use this kind of attack to easily get rid of powerful opponents. However, this was not without restrictions. If he could not communicate with all levels, no matter how powerful this attack was, it would still be relatively independent of each level. In other words, even if the attack on the concept level and the attack on the reality level and the karma level were the same effect, they were absolutely independent and had no relationship with each other. The target of the attack could only be the corresponding existence of the opponent on each level. This obviously also made it impossible for this kind of attack to be completely condensed in the end, even though it had corresponding performance on all the conceptual levels, so that it could not display its overall effect on a single level. However, this was only for other existences that could not communicate with each level. For Luo Fan, who had spent hundreds of billions of years to communicate with a large number of levels, this limit had been completely broken. Now, he could completely condense the effect of a certain power on each level that he could communicate with, and converge it on a certain level to launch a targeted attack. To put it in another way, under normal circumstances, when he launched an attack of a ton, he would be able to condense the effects of the attack in millions of locations and concentrate them on a specific location. In other words, this attack of 1 ton could exert the effect of more than millions of tons. He was using this method in the current situation, and his target was none other than the concept of the existence of the pseudo-heavenly Tao. The slap that Luo Fan swung out contained the supreme destructive power of the arbitration court. It contained the powerful destructive power of almost all living beings in this world, and even the entire world itself. Just one such power was enough to tear the entire world apart, and it was enough to completely kill all living beings in this world. Now that such a power was multiplied by millions of times, it was forcibly sent into the conceptual level and directly targeted the concept of the pseudo-heavenly Tao. It went without saying how terrifying the effect was. In that instant, the space around the heavenly Tao was constantly being destroyed. The heavens and earth, space-time, and all living beings were being reduced to ashes without any process. It was as if the essence of their existence had been extracted from their very foundations. Then, under some kind of terrifying impact, the heavenly Tao also began to cave in. It seemed to have been beaten to the point that its shape had changed. And on the conceptual level, the concept of the pseudo-heavenly Tao began to tremble violently. At this time, through the power of the heavenly Tao, the pseudo-heavenly Tao had already connected its corresponding existences on various levels into a huge network. As a result, any attack against the existence on any level of the pseudo-heavenly Tao would be instantly transferred to countless levels, weakening the effect of the attack by millions of times. At this time, the pseudo-heavenly Tao clearly used the same method to deal with Luo Fan's attack that had been strengthened by millions of times. In this instant, the terrifying power forcefully slammed into the pseudo-heavenly Tao's concept of existence. The huge network instantly produced an effect. Endless power began to transfer from the heavenly Tao to various levels, instantly weakening the attack by millions of times. In the end, the effect of this attack was much less than when it attacked the countless levels at the same time. However, although the effect was much less, the final result was completely different. The previous attack had only caused the pseudo-heavenly Tao's concept of existence to tremble slightly, but this time, the attack was much less effective, but it caused the pseudo-heavenly Tao's concept of existence to collapse. The entire concept of existence seemed to have been casually piled up by countless fragments. As it charged forward, it scattered in all directions, directly dispersing into the surrounding pseudo-heavenly Tao's concept of existence. At this moment, the pseudo-heavenly Tao within the heavenly Tao suddenly let out an earth-shattering scream. The scream was so intense, so shrill, and so horrifying that all the living beings in the world who heard it instantly felt a strong negative emotion rise from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if death had descended upon them in that instant. As the scream rang out, the river that covered the entire world in the real world began to distort wildly. The river had already enveloped the entire world and had even grasped the laws of this world, as well as the space and time within it. As the world began to distort, it naturally caused the world to violently tremble, causing the originally orderly scene in this world to become chaotic. At this moment, the expressions of the many guardians below changed drastically. They withstood the terrifying pressure caused by the scream and began to urge the guardian platform with all their might. Waves of mysterious power continuously fused into the area they were guarding, resisting the chaos caused by the river's twisting and struggling with great difficulty. The destruction of the concept of existence was almost fatal to any existence. Even the pseudo-heavenly Tao was no exception. At this moment, although he was under the protection of the heavenly Tao and did not die from the destruction of the concept of existence, he was only still alive. Right now, his rationality, his mind, his soul, and his thoughts had all become chaotic from the blow. He even vaguely felt as if he had split into trillions of parts and turned into trillions of individuals that were engaged in an intense battle. Seeing this, Luo Fan frowned. He's still not dead? Therefore, he retracted his palm, turned around, and slammed it into the air. With this slap, his palm once again entered the void, and once again gathered all the power and techniques that he could muster in this entire region of the world. However, this slap was no longer targeted at the concept of existence. Instead, it directly slapped into the karma layer, gathering the effects of the countless layers of power that he had communicated with into this layer and charging towards the pseudo-heavenly Tao's karma origin. In the blink of an eye, it had already crossed the wondrous space and karma of the karma layer and directly blasted into the karma origin. At this moment, the pseudo-heavenly Tao's original preparations took effect once again. The network above the karma origin once again transferred the attack to the countless layers, to the existence corresponding to the pseudo-heavenly Tao. With this transfer, the attack against the karma origin was naturally weakened countless times. However, because the base number was too large, the attack's effect was still unimaginably powerful. In the end, it easily shattered the karma origin, turning it into countless fragments that drifted into the heavenly Tao's karma origin. As this happened, the pseudo-heavenly Tao's screams became even more mournful. As the churning became more and more powerful, its figure also became more and more wretched. In fact, even the long river that was originally condensed seemed to have split into countless tributaries. It was almost difficult to treat it as a whole. The figure of the old man that appeared in the pseudo-heavenly Tao had completely dissipated and turned into countless light shadows that flew around like headless flies in the long river formed by the heavenly Tao. Occasionally, light shadows would come into contact with each other, and as if a battle switch had been turned on, they began to attack and kill each other in a frenzy. The scene was so tragic that it was as if they were irreconcilable enemies. This change caused the pseudo-heavenly Tao's impact and influence on the world to become even more intense. During this process, the many guardians had no choice but to work harder to protect the area they were guarding, and they also had no choice but to divert more energy to resist all the changes that could cause the world to turn upside down. Under such circumstances, They no longer had any thoughts to care about how the battle between Luo Fan and the pseudo-heavenly Tao would develop, nor did they have any thoughts to care about the arbitration court, what happened to the arbitration judge, and why such a change happened at this moment. Luo Fan didn't stop at all. He retracted his sword and blasted it out. Every time he blasted it out, it was aimed at a different direction and entered a different layer. And every time he blasted it out, it was also condensed with endless power that he could gather and all the power that he could gather. Under his actions, the pseudo-heavenly Tao became more and more chaotic, and the tributaries of the long river split up. Time passed by minute, and before he knew it, several years had passed. During these years, Luo Fan didn't stop for a single moment. He constantly blasted the power that he could gather into a certain layer, shattering the existence that corresponded to the pseudo-heavenly Tao in a certain layer. And the pseudo-heavenly Tao's form was also deteriorating over the years. Now, after several years, the long river that was originally condensed into one had completely split into countless tributaries that covered the entire void. It looked like a huge network that directly enveloped this part of the world. As for the figure that belonged to the pseudo-heavenly Tao inside the heavenly Tao, it had completely disappeared. It had turned into a blurry light shadow that scattered in all directions and disappeared within the heavenly Tao.